I spend a lot of time alone in the woods. That's not a disclaimer or a character detail I'm offering for sympathy. It's context. I need you to understand that when I tell you what happened in the Monongahela in September of 2022, I'm not telling it as someone who startles at every snapped twig or mistakes a deer for a monster. I've been backpacking and solo camping across West Virginia and Virginia since I was 16. I grew up in Elkins, about 30 miles from the National Forest boundary, and by the time I was 20, I'd logged more nights in the backcountry than most people log in a lifetime. I know the sounds the forest makes. I know the difference between a bear moving through underbrush and a branch falling under its own weight. I know what raccoons sound like on a tent and what rain sounds like on different types of nylon at different intensities. I know these woods, and what I heard that night was not something I knew. The trip was a solo overnighter, the kind I'd done 100 times. I drove out on a Friday afternoon in mid-September, parked at a pull-off on a Forest Service road south of Durban, and hiked about a mile into the timber to a spot I'd used before. It was a flat bench of ground above a small creek, sheltered on 3 sides by a stand of mature hemlock and open on the 4th to a gentle slope that dropped down to the water. The creek was low that time of year, barely a foot across at its widest, running clear over a bed of smooth stones with that quiet, musical trickle. That's one of the best sounds in the world when you're trying to fall asleep outdoors. I set up my tent on the flattest section of the bench, strung my food bag on a line between 2 trees, cooked a simple dinner on my camp stove, and sat on a log by the creek watching the light fade through the canopy until the sky went from gold to purple to black. The forecast had called for a chance of rain overnight, which in the mountains means somewhere between a drizzle and a deluge, depending on which hollow you're in and what the wind decides to do. I'd packed accordingly, waterproofed my tent seams before the trip, and brought a ground cloth and a dry bag for my clothes. When the first drops started hitting the rainfly around 8, I was already in my sleeping bag with a headlamp and a paperback, settled in for the night with the comfortable routine of someone who had done this enough times that the process was automatic. The rain picked up fast. Within 30 minutes, it went from a gentle patter to a steady, driving downpour that hit the nylon with a force that vibrated through the tent walls and made the fabric thrum like a drum skin. I could hear the creek changing, the quiet trickle transforming into a rush as the water level rose with the runoff from the hillside above. The sound went from musical to muscular, a constant low roar that filled the hollow and layered over the rain until the 2 sounds merged into a wall of white noise that should have put me to sleep within minutes. But I couldn't sleep. Something about the sound was keeping me on the edge of consciousness, a low-level alertness that I couldn't attribute to any specific stimulus. I lay there with my headlamp off and my eyes open, and I listened. The rain, the creek. The wind is pushing through the hemlock branches above. And then, underneath it all, so faint that I had to stop breathing to hear it, something else. Footsteps. I've heard people walk in the woods at night before. Hikers coming through a campsite. Hunters move to their stands before dawn. Park rangers are doing checks. Human footsteps in the forest have a particular quality. The irregular rhythm of someone navigating uneven terrain, the occasional stumble, the crunch of leaves, or the snap of a small branch underfoot. These footsteps were different. They were even, perfectly, metronomically even, each step landing with the same weight and the same duration as the one before it, like a metronome set to a slow tempo. And they were heavy, not the heavy of a large person. The heaviness of something that was pressing into the ground with more force than its size should have produced, each footfall landing with a deep, soft impact that I could feel through the floor of the tent as much as I could hear through the rain. They were circling my campsite, moving in a slow, deliberate loop around the perimeter of the bench where my tent sat, maybe 15 feet from the tent walls, following a path that took them around the back of the site near the hemlocks, across the open slope above the creek, and back around to the starting point. One circuit took about 45 seconds. I counted. I lay in my sleeping bag, and I counted the footsteps, and I tracked the sound as it moved around me, and I tried to assign it to something rational. A bear walking upright, a deer with an unusual gait. Another hiker, confused by the rain, was circling the campsite, trying to figure out if it was occupied, but none of those explanations held. Bears don't walk in perfect circles with metronomic precision. Deer don't have bipedal footfalls, and no human walks barefoot through the rain in the national forest at 10 o'clock at night with the mechanical evenness of a wind-up toy. The footsteps completed one circuit, then a second. On the second pass, I confirmed what I'd suspected on the first. The radius was tighter. Whatever was walking had closed the distance by maybe 2 or 3 feet, the way a spiral tightens as it moves inward. The footsteps were louder now, closer, and I could hear details I'd missed on the first pass. The sound of wet earth compressing under weight, the faint sucking noise of mud releasing a foot as it lifted, and breathing, low, steady, regular, with a depth that suggested a large chest cavity expanding and contracting in rhythm with the steps. Not labored, not excited, just breathing, the autonomic function of something alive and present and unhurried. Third circuit, tighter still, maybe 10 feet from the tent now, close enough that I could place each footstep with precision, could track the sound from the back of the tent across the left side to the front and around the right side and back again. The breathing was clearer here, audible between footsteps, and it had a quality I didn't want to think about. It was wet, not congested, not sick, but wet in the way that breathing gets when the mouth is open and the rain is falling directly into it, and the person doesn't close their mouth, because closing their mouth isn't something they think to do. I was lying on my back with my arms inside the sleeping bag, and my hands pressed flat against my thighs. I was not moving. I was not breathing loudly. I was doing everything that 20 years of backcountry experience had taught me to do when something large was near your tent at night. Stay still. Stay quiet. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Wait for it to lose interest and move on. This is the protocol for bears, for bobcats, for the rare mountain lion that wanders through the eastern mountains. It is the protocol for animals that are curious, but not invested, that will investigate a campsite and leave when they find nothing worth the effort. The fourth circuit was close enough that I could hear each footstep as a distinct event, the placement of weight on the ground, followed by the shift of mass forward and the lifting of the rear foot, a biomechanical sequence that I could follow with the same clarity. I'd follow someone walking across a wooden floor in the room above me, and on this fourth pass, the footsteps stopped, directly outside the door flap, 6 inches of nylon between whatever was out there and the interior of the tent where I lay. I could see the fabric move. The door panel of the tent, a single layer of ripstop nylon with a mesh insert for ventilation, pressed inward about an inch. Not from the wind, not from rain accumulation, from pressure. Something was leaning against the door of the tent with a slow, steady weight that pushed the fabric inward toward me, testing it, feeling the give of the material, the flex of the poles, the resistance of the structure. I could see the outline of the pressure point, roughly circular, about the size of a palm, centered at a height of maybe 3 feet above the ground. It held there, steady, patient. The breathing was louder now, separated from me by nothing but the tent fabric, and I could feel it, not hear it, feel it, the warmth of an exhalation pressing through the nylon and touching my face like the ghost of someone else's breath. I have never in my life been that still. My body went rigid in a way that felt involuntary, every muscle locked, every joint frozen, the biological override that happens when the deeper, older parts of your brain take control and your conscious mind becomes a passenger. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. My hands were fists inside the sleeping bag, and my jaw was clenched so tight I could feel my teeth grinding, and my eyes were open and focused on the point where the fabric pressed inward, and I waited. I waited the way prey waits when the predator is close enough to touch, with absolute, total, perfect stillness. 5 minutes, maybe longer. The pressure held against the door of the tent, and the breathing continued, and the rain fell, and the creek roared, and I lay there and did nothing because there was nothing to do. And then the pressure was released. The fabric sprang back to its normal shape. The breathing moved away from the door, not fading gradually but stepping back. 1 step, 2, 3, and then resuming that same measured, heavy stride, walking away from the tent in a straight line, not circling anymore, moving with purpose, with direction, walking toward the creek. I heard it reach the water. The footsteps changed from the soft compression of earth to the splash and crunch of someone walking through a shallow stream. But the creek wasn't shallow anymore. The rain had raised it to at least 2 feet deep, and the current was fast enough to move stones along the bottom. I could hear them clicking and tumbling. And through that current, through water that would have knocked most people off their feet, the footsteps continued. Same pace, same rhythm, same metronomic evenness. The water didn't slow it down, didn't alter its stride, didn't seem to register as an obstacle at all. The splashing grew fainter as it crossed, and then there was a moment of silence as it reached the far bank, and then the sound of footsteps on earth again, moving into the forest on the other side, growing quieter and quieter, until the rain absorbed them and they were gone. I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent with every sense amplified to a pitch that made the rain sound like gunfire and the creek sound like a highway and my own heartbeat sound like someone knocking on a door. I lay there until the sky lightened behind the clouds and the rain eased to a drizzle and the first gray light of morning crept into the hollow and made the world look solid again. I got out of the tent as soon as there was enough light to see. The campsite was a mess. My camp stove had been knocked over, probably by the rain, and the ground cloth was partially pulled out from under the tent floor. But those details didn't register because I was looking at the ground, at the mud, at what the rain had preserved in the soft earth around my tent. Footprints, a complete circuit of them, 4 concentric rings pressed into the mud, each one slightly tighter than the last, tracing the exact path I'd heard during the night. The prints were bare feet, no boot tread, no shoe sole. Bare human feet pressed into wet earth with enough force to sink 2 inches deep. But they weren't human feet. They were too large, significantly too large. I wear a size 11, and these prints were at least half again as long, maybe 16 or 17 inches from heel to toe. The toes were wrong. They were too long, extending forward like fingers rather than the blunt, compressed toes of a modern human foot, and they were spread wide, gripping the earth with each step the way a hand grips a surface for purchase. The arch was pronounced, almost exaggerated, creating a gap between the ball and the heel where no mud had been compressed. And the stride was wrong, too long for walking. Each print was separated from the next by nearly 4 feet, a distance that would require someone over 7 feet tall to achieve at a walking pace. I followed the prints out of the spiral and toward the creek. They continued in a straight line, getting deeper as the ground sloped toward the water, each one pressed firmly into the mud with the same deliberate weight. They entered the creek at a point where the water was now running about 18 inches deep and still fast from the overnight rain. I walked to the other side. I searched the far bank for 10 minutes, walking up and down the creek edge, looking for the point where the footprints emerged from the water. They didn't. The prints entered the creek, and they didn't come out on the other side. I checked 100 yards in each direction. No prints, no disturbed earth, no broken vegetation on the bank. Whatever had walked into that creek had either stayed in the water and traveled downstream, or it had gone into the creek and simply stopped existing. I packed my camp in 15 minutes. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't filter the water. I rolled everything into my pack, and I hiked back to the Forest Service Road, and I drove to Elkins, and I sat in the parking lot of the Walmart for an hour because I needed to be around people and fluorescent lights and the mundane, reassuring commerce of a world that operated according to rules I understood. I've been back to the Monongahela since then. I've camped solo since then, but I've never gone back to that specific site, and I don't camp near creeks anymore if the forecast calls for rain. Not because I think the rain caused what happened, but because of what the rain revealed. The footprints in the mud were precise, clear, and undeniable. They were the physical record of something that walked on 2 legs with bare feet that weren't human, that circled my tent 4 times with a patience that suggested ritual rather than curiosity, that pressed against the door of my tent and breathed on me through the nylon, and then walked into a flooded creek and vanished. I've told this story to 3 people. 2 of them suggested it was a bear walking on its hind legs, which doesn't account for the barefoot prints, or the 16-inch length, or the finger-like toes. The 3rd person, an old man I know in Elkins, who has spent his entire life in these mountains, listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said the old people used to say there were things in the deep hollows that came out when it rained. He said the rain was like a door for them, something about the sound or the water, or the way the world changes when it's wet that lets them move through spaces they can't normally reach. He said they walk the creeks because the water is how they travel, and they go back into it when they're done. He said they've been here longer than people. He said they don't mean harm. They're just curious. They circle because they're trying to understand what you are. I asked him what they are. He shook his head and said he didn't know. Nobody does. They don't have a name. Not in English. Not in any language he knew. They're just the things that come out when it rains. And if you're smart, he said, you stay in your tent and you don't move and you let them finish their circles and go back to the water, and you don't follow the prints to the creek. Because the prints go in, he said, but they don't come out. And sometimes the people who follow them don't come out either. Nate and I had been planning the Cranberry River trip for most of the summer. We'd talked about it over beers at his place in Marlinton, spreading a topo map across his kitchen table and tracing the river's path through the cranberry wilderness, marking the flat spots along the bank where we could set up camp and the deeper pools where the native brook trout held in the shadows of the rhododendron. The plan was simple. 3 days, 2 nights, hiking the river trail south from the Cranberry campground and fishing our way downstream to a takeout point where Nate's girlfriend would pick us up. We'd done trips like this before, Nate and I, half a dozen times over the years since we'd met working summer maintenance for the Forest Service back in our 20s. He knew the backcountry the way I knew it, not from guidebooks or apps, but from boots on the ground, from sleeping in it and sweating through it and learning its moods the way you learn the moods of a person you live with. We were both in our mid-30s now, both carrying a little more weight and a little less enthusiasm than we'd had at 22. But the woods still felt like the place where we were most ourselves, and this trip was something we needed. We started on a Friday morning in late September, parking at the campground trailhead and hiking south along the river through a corridor of hemlock and red spruce that closed over the trail like a cathedral ceiling. The weather was overcast but dry, the kind of gray mountain day that can go either way, and the forecast called for scattered showers in the evening, with clearing overnight. We made good time, covering about 4 miles by early afternoon and reaching the spot we'd marked on the map as our first campsite, a wide gravel bar on the inside of a river bend where the ground was level and the water ran shallow and clear over a bed of polished stones. The rain started earlier than the forecast predicted. Around 3 in the afternoon, the scattered showers consolidated into a steady, soaking rain that came in from the northwest and settled over the valley with the heavy, permanent feel of a system that wasn't going anywhere. We were still setting up camp when the gravel bar started to flood. The river rose fast, the way mountain rivers do when the watershed above is steep and the soil is already saturated from a wet summer. Within an hour, the water had risen a foot and was creeping across the gravel toward our tents. Nate looked at me, and I looked at the river, and we both knew the sight was done. We packed up in the rain and moved uphill, looking for higher ground that was flat enough to pitch on. The problem with the cranberry drainage is that the river runs through a narrow valley with steep, forested slopes on both sides, and flat ground near the water is rare. What's above the flood line tends to be angled, rocky, root-choked, or all three. We bushwhacked along the hillside for maybe 20 minutes, getting wetter and more irritated with each step before we found it. A flat stretch of ground about 50 yards uphill from the river, in the shadow of a railroad bridge. The bridge was old. I'd seen it on the topo map, a thin black line crossing the river at an elevation that put it about 40 feet above the water, but I hadn't thought much about it. The rail line had been abandoned decades ago, part of a logging railroad network that had been built in the early 20th century to haul timber out of the Cranberry, and had been left to rust when the logging stopped. The bridge itself was a steel truss structure, maybe 60 feet long, spanning the river from one hillside to the other on concrete abutments that were stained with mineral deposits and cracked with age. The steel was dark orange with rust, the trusses and cross members forming a skeletal framework against the gray sky, and the ties that had once held the rails were rotted to the point where some had fallen out entirely, leaving gaps in the deck that showed the river moving 40 feet below. The rails themselves were gone, probably salvaged years ago for scrap. What remained was the skeleton, the iron bones of a structure that had outlived its purpose and was slowly being reclaimed by time and weather. The flat ground beneath the bridge wasn't ideal, but it was better than anything else we'd found. A section of earth about 20 feet wide and maybe 30 feet long, sheltered partially by the bridge deck above, with a mix of gravel and packed dirt that would drain better than the clay soil on the slopes. We set up our tents side by side, strung a tarp between two of the bridge's concrete abutment walls, and cooked dinner on Nate's camp stove in the relative dry of the tarp shelter. Rice and canned chili, eaten in the fading light, while the rain hammered the tarp and the river roared below us, and the bridge loomed overhead like the ribcage of something enormous. Nate was in good spirits despite the weather. He was the kind of person who adjusted to setbacks with an ease I envied, the kind who could turn a flooded campsite and a forced relocation into a story he'd tell with enthusiasm at the next barbecue. We ate and talked and drank coffee and watched the rain, and by 10 o'clock we were both tired enough that the wet, uncomfortable reality of our situation seemed manageable. Nate zipped into his tent. I zipped into mine. The rain continued, steady and unrelenting, and I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to it fall on the nylon above me, and on the steel of the bridge further above, and on the surface of the river somewhere below, and to the side, all of it blending into a layered percussion that was almost musical in its complexity. I fell asleep around 10:30. I know this because I checked my watch before closing my eyes, a habit I'd developed on solo trips and maintained even when camping with company. The next time I checked, it was 12:14 in the morning, and I was wide awake. What woke me was a sound from above, not from the rain or the wind or the river, from the bridge, a scraping. Low and metallic, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across steel. It started at one end of the bridge, the far end, the side that connected to the hillside across the river from where we were camped, and it moved slowly along the deck toward our side. The sound was deliberate and measured, not the random scraping of a branch blown across the structure by wind or the accidental clatter of loose debris shifting in a storm. This was something being pulled. The rhythm was too consistent, too sustained, the kind of sound you'd produce if you were dragging a heavy chain across the steel rails of a bridge deck, each link catching on the next crossmember and clanking over it before catching on the next. I lay in my tent, and I stared upward at the ceiling, and I listened as the sound crossed the bridge from the far side to the center. It took maybe 2 minutes. The scraping was loud enough to hear clearly over the rain, a metallic groan and clatter that resonated through the steel trusses and the concrete abutments and the ground beneath my tent. When it reached the center of the bridge, directly above our campsite, it stopped. Silence. Or rather, the relative silence of rain falling on a bridge with nothing else happening. The scraping had ceased, and the bridge was still, and I lay there waiting for it to resume, waiting for the sound to continue across to our side and descend the hillside and reveal itself as a fallen cable, or a section of loose railing being moved by the wind, or any of the dozen explanations my mind was assembling and discarding. With increasing desperation, it didn't resume. Instead, a new sound began. From the center of the bridge, from the point directly above us, something started to descend. I could hear it clearly, a metallic uncoiling, link by link, the sound of a heavy chain paying out from a spool or a pile, descending through the open gaps in the bridge deck, dropping toward the ground. Each link made a distinct sound as it cleared the edge and joined the length below it, a muffled clink that was swallowed quickly by the rain, but repeated with a regularity that told me the chain, whatever it was being lowered at a controlled, deliberate pace. Not dropped, not released, lowered, fed out slowly, the way a fisherman lowers a line. I heard Nate move in his tent, the rustle of a sleeping bag, the quiet sound of him sitting up. I could picture him doing exactly what I was doing. Lying still, eyes open, staring upward at a tent ceiling that was vibrating slightly with each clink of the descending chain. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us called out. We just lay there in our separate tents, 15 feet apart, listening to something lower itself from the bridge above us with the patience of a spider descending a thread. The sound continued for maybe 3 minutes, each link clinking against the ones below it, the chain getting longer, the lowest point of it getting closer to the ground. I tried to calculate the distance. The bridge deck was roughly 40 feet above us. If the chain had started from the deck and was being lowered at about a foot every few seconds, then after 3 minutes it would have descended maybe 20 or 25 feet. which would put the bottom of it about 15 feet above us. Then 10. The clinks were getting louder as the chain grew longer, and the weight of it increased, and the bottom swung slightly in the wind, each link arriving with a heavier, more resonant impact. It stopped. The last link clinked into place, and the chain hung there. I couldn't see it. The rain and the darkness and the tent ceiling between me and the bridge made it invisible. But I could hear it. The faint, rhythmic creak of heavy metal swinging in the wind. The same sound an old gate makes when it sways on its hinges, back and forth, directly above the space between our tents. I could feel it too, the way you feel the presence of a large object nearby, a displacement in the air pressure, a weight hanging above you that your body can sense even when your eyes can't confirm. Nate's voice came through the rain, barely above a whisper. "You hear that?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. He didn't say anything else. We lay in our tent, and we listened to the chain swing above us, and neither of us moved. Not because we were paralyzed or frozen, though fear was certainly part of it, but because there was nothing to do. Whatever was hanging from the bridge was hanging from the bridge, and getting out of the tent meant standing up and looking at it, and neither of us was prepared to do that in the dark, in the rain. The chain swung for hours. The sound varied slightly with the wind, sometimes barely audible, sometimes loud enough that I could hear individual links grinding against each other as the chain twisted and untwisted in the gusts. At some point, I became aware that the sound had a secondary quality, an overtone beneath the metallic creaking that I hadn't noticed at first. A low, sustained vibration, almost subsonic, that traveled through the chain and into the bridge structure, and down through the abutments, and into the ground, and up through the floor of my tent, and into my body. I could feel it in my chest and in my teeth and in the hollow spaces behind my eyes. It wasn't a sound you heard. It was a sound you experienced, the way you experience the bass at a concert, a physical sensation that bypassed the ears entirely. Dawn came slowly. The rain eased to a drizzle around 5 and the sky began to lighten by 5:30, turning the darkness from absolute to graduated, the vague shapes of trees and bridge and hillside emerging from the black, like a photograph developing in reverse. I lay in my tent and watched the light change and listened. The chain had gone silent sometime in the last hour, the creaking fading so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint the moment it stopped. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the gray morning. The air was cold and wet and smelled like river stone and decaying leaves. Nate was already out, standing at the base of the nearest concrete abutment, looking up at the bridge. I walked over and stood beside him, and we both looked. The bridge was empty. The steel trusses stood in their rusted framework exactly as they had the day before. The gaps in the deck where ties had rotted away showed nothing but the gray sky beyond. No chain, no rope, no cable, no hardware of any kind hanging from the structure, or coiled on the deck, or draped over the railings. Nothing. The bridge was exactly what it had been when we arrived. An abandoned railroad bridge in an advanced state of decay, empty of everything except rust and memory. Nate looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that we had lain in our tents for 4 hours, listening to something that was no longer there, and possibly had never been there in any physical sense, and that saying this out loud would require us to explain it. And explaining it was not something either of us was capable of doing. I was turning to go back to my tent when Nate said, "Wait." He was looking at the abutment wall, the concrete face of the nearest support pillar. He stepped closer. I followed. On the surface of the concrete, at about eye level, scratched into the rust-stained surface with something sharp, was a marking. Letters and numbers. They were rough but legible, carved through the mineral deposits and into the concrete beneath, with enough force to leave a groove, maybe 1/8 of an inch deep. The scratches were bright against the dark staining, the exposed concrete clean and pale, which meant they were fresh, recent, not years old, not decades old. The edges hadn't weathered. The concrete dust from the carving was still visible in the grooves. It was a date, yesterday's date, the date we arrived. The date we had camped beneath the bridge and listened to something drag a chain across the deck and lower it toward us in the dark. Nate took a picture with his phone. I took one with mine. We packed our camp in silence and hiked out in the drizzle, back the way we'd come, retracing our steps along the river trail to the campground trailhead where the truck was parked. The drive back to Marlinton took 45 minutes, and we didn't speak for most of it. When Nate finally broke the silence, he said one thing. He said that the bridge has been abandoned since the 60s. Nobody goes up there. I nodded. He said the date on the concrete was carved from the outside, from the face of the abutment that you can only reach by climbing the abutment or leaning over the edge of the bridge. He said whoever carved it did it recently, probably during the night, probably while we were lying in our tents listening to the chain. He said they knew we were there, they knew the date, and they wanted to leave a record that we had been there too. I've thought about that last part more than anything else. The record. The date scratched into the concrete like a tally mark, proof that on this night, in this rain, beneath this bridge, something happened. Not a threat, not a warning. A notation. The kind of mark you make when you're keeping count. I've looked up the history of that bridge and the rail line it served. 3 people died during its construction in 1908. A logger fell from the deck in 1923. A hiker went missing in the drainage in 1991 and was found a week later, downstream, and drowned, though the water at the time was barely knee-deep. Each event has a date. Each date is a mark on a timeline. And I wonder if somewhere on that bridge, on the abutments or the trusses, or the underside of the deck where nobody looks, there are other dates, other notations. A record kept in rust and concrete of every person who has slept beneath that bridge and listened to the chain descend in the dark. Every person who has been counted. Every person who has been marked. Nate and I still camp together. We did a trip to the Dolly Sods last month. 3 days of clear weather and good fishing. We don't talk about the Cranberry River. We don't talk about the bridge. But I noticed that when we were picking our campsite, Nate walked a wide circle around the clearing before he set up, looking up at the canopy, checking the terrain. When I asked what he was looking for, he said nothing, just making sure there's nothing overhead. And I understood, because the thing about what happened beneath that bridge isn't the chain or the sound or the date on the concrete. It's the knowledge that something was above us, that we were beneath it, that whatever it was had the patience to lower itself toward us one link at a time and the restraint to stop before it reached us. And the only evidence it left was a date. Our date. The night we became part of whatever count is being kept on that bridge in the mountains, in the rain, in the dark, where the trains don't run anymore, and something else moves across the rails instead. The hollow outside of Richwood was a place I'd found on a topo map 2 years before I actually camped there. I'd been tracing the contour lines of Nicholas County on a winter evening, the way I do when I'm planning trips for the coming season, and the hollow caught my eye because of its shape. It was a near-perfect bowl, a concavity in the terrain where 3 ridges converge. D and the land dropped into a depression maybe 200 feet deep and a quarter-mile across, with a creek running through the bottom and dense hemlock covering the slopes so thickly that the contour lines practically disappeared beneath the green shading on the satellite overlay. It looked sheltered, protected, the kind of place that would hold warmth in the fall and shed rain in the spring, and offer the deep, muffled quiet that I crave when the noise of my life in Summersville gets to be too much. I'm a high school guidance counselor. I say that because people assume solo campers are loners or misanthropes or people running from something. And while I won't deny that the woods serve as a pressure valve for me, the pressure I'm releasing isn't existential, it's vocational. I spend my days listening to teenagers talk about things that are breaking them: abuse and addiction and poverty and the slow, grinding despair of growing up in a place where the economy died before they were born. I love the work. I'm good at it, but it fills me up in a way that requires emptying. And the emptying happens best in places where the only voice is the wind and the only problems are practical. Where to hang my hammock, how to filter water, what to cook over a fire that I built with my own hands. The hollow outside Richwood was supposed to be one of those places. A reset, a breath. I hiked in on a Friday afternoon in late October of 2023, following a game trail that dropped off a forest road and descended through the hemlock into the bowl. The trail was faint, more suggestion than path, and the hemlock canopy closed over my head within the first 100 yards, turning the afternoon light from gold to green to something approaching dusk, even though it was barely 4 o'clock. The hollow was everything the map had promised. Sheltered, quiet, carpeted with a thick layer of hemlock needles that softened every footstep and muffled every sound. The creek at the bottom was shallow and clear, running over a bed of sandstone and leaf litter with a gentle murmur that seemed designed to induce sleep. I found a good spot for my hammock, between two hemlocks about 50 yards from the creek, strung my tarp above it, and set up camp with the unhurried satisfaction of a person who has arrived exactly where they want to be. The rain started earlier than expected, around 10, not long after I'd climbed into my hammock and pulled the quilt around me. It came in fast, the way mountain rain does when the system is tight and concentrated, going from nothing to a heavy, steady downpour in less than 5 minutes. The tarp did its job, shedding the water to either side and keeping me dry, but the sound was enormous. That's what I hadn't anticipated about the hollow. The bowl-shaped terrain acted like an amphitheater, amplifying every sound that entered it and reflecting it off the slopes and back toward the center. The rain on the hemlock canopy became a roar. The creek, which had been a murmur an hour earlier, turned into a rushing channel that sounded like a highway. The combined noise was so intense that I could barely hear my own thoughts, let alone anything happening beyond the immediate vicinity of my hammock. That's why it took me so long to hear the crying. It started as a thread of sound woven into the rain, so faint and so high-pitched that I mistook it at first for a bird call or the whine of wind through a gap in the canopy. But it persisted, and as I lay in my hammock and focused on it, filtering it out from the background noise, the way you filter a conversation out of a crowded room, it resolved into something unmistakable. A child's voice, crying, not the sharp, startled cry of a kid who's fallen, or the angry wail of a tantrum. This was quiet and exhausted, the kind of crying that comes at the end of a long period of distress, when the energy for screaming is gone, and all that remains is a thin, keening sob that rises and falls with the breath, each exhale carrying a note of despair so pure, it's almost musical. It was coming from deeper in the hollow, somewhere beyond the reach of my headlamp, in the direction of the creek's source where the ridges converge. And the hemlock grew thickest. I sat up in my hammock. The crying continued, steady and small, threading through the rain with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible given the ambient noise level. It was as if the hollow's acoustics, which amplified everything else into a roar, had carved out a channel for this specific sound, a frequency that traveled through the bowl without interference and arrived at my ears with the intimate precision of a whisper. I called out, "Hello, is someone out there?" My voice sounded flat and absorbed, swallowed by the rain and the hemlock before it traveled 10 feet. The crying stopped, instantly, cut off mid-sob, the way a sound stops when the source becomes aware it's being heard. I waited, 10 seconds, 20, 30. The rain filled the silence with its own noise, and I began to convince myself I'd imagined it, that the acoustics of the hollow had played a trick on my tired brain, constructing a pattern from random noise, the way the mind constructs faces from clouds. Then the crying started again. Closer. Significantly closer. Maybe 100 feet into the darkness beyond my headlamp's reach, in the direction I'd been listening. The same voice, the same exhausted, hopeless sobbing, but louder now, more distinct. The individual inhalations and exhalations audible between sobs. A child. Out in the rain. In the dark. In a hollow miles from the nearest road in Nicholas County, at 11 o'clock at night. I know what you're thinking because I was thinking it too. Lost kid. Separated from a family camping nearby. Wandered off the trail and got turned around in the dark and the rain and ended up in this hollow crying for help. It happens. Not often, but it happens. Especially in the fall when hunting season brings families into the backcountry who don't always keep track of their children the way they should. Every instinct I had, every professional bone in my body that had spent 15 years listening to young people in distress and responding to their needs, told me to get out of the hammock and find that child. I put on my boots. I grabbed my flashlight, the big one, a 1,000-lumen beam that could cut through rain and fog and hemlock shadow like a searchlight. I climbed out of the hammock. Kay and I walked toward the crying. The beam showed me hemlock trunks and rain and the dark mulch of the forest floor. The crying was ahead of me, steady, persistent, a sound that pulled me forward with a force that felt almost physical, the way a current pulls a swimmer, not violently, but irresistibly. I walked 30 feet, 50. The crying maintained its distance, staying roughly 100 feet ahead of me, never getting louder, never getting softer. I stopped. The crying stopped. I waited. It started again, from the same distance, the same direction. I walked another 50 feet. Same thing. The source of the sound was retreating as I advanced, matching my pace, maintaining the gap between us with a precision that started to feel less like a coincidence and more like intention. I should have stopped then. I should have recognized the pattern for what it was and turned around and gone back to my hammock and dealt with the guilt of not responding to a child in distress by reminding myself that children in distress don't maintain a perfect 100-foot radius from the person trying to help them. But the sound was so real, so specific, so perfectly calibrated to trigger the exact response it was triggering in me. The trembling inhalation, the shaking exhale, the hitch in the breath between sobs sounds like a small body convulsing with cold or fear. It was flawless. It was the most convincing reproduction of human suffering I have ever heard, and I walked toward it for a quarter mile through the rain and the dark because my heart wouldn't let my brain take control. I was deep in the hollow now, much deeper than I'd intended. The hemlock had closed in to the point where my flashlight beam was hitting trunks within 20 feet, and the canopy above was so dense that the rain barely reached me, filtering instead through layers of needles until it arrived as a fine mist. The creek was somewhere to my left, louder now, swollen with runoff. My camp was behind me, invisible, unreachable in the dark, without a trail to follow. I'd been walking on instinct, following the sound, and the sound had led me into a part of the hollow that I hadn't explored and didn't know. The crying stopped, not gradually, not with a trailing off. It stopped the way a recording stops when you press pause. One moment it was there, 100 feet ahead, sobbing in the rain. The next moment, it was gone, and the hollow was filled only with the sound of water, the creek, the rain, and the dripping of the canopy, and a silence in the space where the crying had been that felt like a hole in the air. I stood still. My flashlight beam cut a bright cone through the mist and the hemlock trunks and illuminated nothing. No child, no person, no source for the sound I'd been following for 10 minutes. Just the forest, dark and wet and indifferent. And then I heard something behind me, between me and my campsite, between me and the direction I'd come from. A sound that was not crying, not a child's voice, not a voice at all. It was breathing, deep, slow, adult breathing. The kind that comes from a large chest expanding and contracting with the unhurried rhythm of something that doesn't need to hurry because it's already where it wants to be. It was low and patient and steady, and it was coming from a point in the darkness, maybe 30 feet behind me, directly in the path I'd walked to get here. I turned around. The flashlight beam swept through the trees and found nothing. The breathing continued, coming from a spot the light should have revealed but didn't. I could hear it clearly now. Each inhalation a slow draw of air through an open mouth, each exhalation a measured release that I could almost feel on the back of my neck despite the distance. It had the quality of something that had been there for a while, something that had been walking behind me, matching my pace, staying in my blind spot, patient and quiet, while the crying drew me deeper into the hollow and further from my camp. Whatever had been crying wasn't a child. The realization landed in my chest like a physical blow. It was a lure, a sound designed to trigger a specific response, to exploit the empathy that makes humans walk towards suffering instead of away from it. And it had worked. I was a quarter mile from my campsite, alone in the dark, in a hollow I didn't know, with something between me and the only way out that I could hear breathing but couldn't see. I did the only thing I could think of. I turned off my flashlight. The darkness was total, absolute, the kind of dark that exists only under a heavy canopy on a moonless, overcast night in the mountains. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but I could hear. The breathing was still there, still behind me, still steady, and I moved, not toward it, not directly away from it, sideways. I stepped off the path I'd been walking and moved laterally through the hemlock, one hand in front of my face to ward off branches, my feet feeling for each step before committing my weight. I moved slowly, deliberately, making as little noise as possible on the needle-covered ground. The breathing didn't follow. It stayed where it was, fixed in the spot where I'd been standing, as if it had been waiting for me at that exact point and hadn't anticipated that I'd step off the line. I circled wide, moving through the trees in what I hoped was a semicircle that would bring me back toward my camp without crossing the path where the breathing was. The rain helped. It covered the small sounds I made, and it gave me a directional reference, the creek, which I could hear to my left, growing louder as I moved, telling me I was heading roughly toward the bottom of the hollow where my camp was. It took me 40 minutes to get back, 40 minutes of blind navigation through hemlock forest in the rain, tripping over roots, walking face first into branches, my hands scraped raw from feeling my way through the dark. I found my camp by nearly walking into my tarp, the edge of it brushing my forehead like a hand. I climbed into my hammock, and I lay there, and I listened. The breathing was gone. The crying was gone. The hollow held nothing but rain and creek, and the tick of water dripping from the tarp. I didn't sleep. I lay in my hammock until dawn came gray and slow through the canopy, and the rain eased to a mist, and the hollow revealed itself as a place of dripping trees and swollen water, and nothing else, nothing visible, nothing audible, just the forest, wet and still, looking exactly the way a forest is supposed to look on a rainy morning when nothing unusual has happened. I packed my camp and hiked out. I drove back to Summersville, went to bed, and didn't tell anyone what had happened for 6 months. When I finally told my brother, over the phone on a Sunday evening, he was quiet for a while. Then he said something about acoustic anomalies in concave terrain, about how hollows can produce auditory illusions, about the way the human brain interprets ambiguous sound patterns by mapping them onto familiar templates. He's an engineer. He thinks in terms of phenomena and explanations. I let him talk, but I know what I heard. I heard a child crying in the dark, and I followed the sound because that's what people do, and something was counting on that. Something that knows how we're built, what sounds we can't ignore, what frequencies of distress bypass the rational mind and go straight to the part of us that moves towards suffering without thinking. It used the crying the way a fisherman uses a lure, casting it into the hollow, letting it drift through the rain, waiting for someone to follow it into the deep water. And when I was deep enough, when I was far enough from camp and close enough to whatever was waiting, the crying stopped and the breathing started, and I understood, too late, that the hollow wasn't empty. It was occupied by something that had learned, over a long time, exactly what sounds to make to bring people closer. And I wonder how many times it's worked. I wonder how many people have followed that crying into the hemlock in the dark and the rain and never found their way back to the path. I wonder if some of the missing persons reports from Nicholas County, the ones with no evidence, no witnesses, and no explanation, started the same way mine did. There was a sound in the hollow that sounded like a child, and the instinct, irresistible and fatal, to walk toward it. Spruce Knob is the highest point in West Virginia, just under 5,000 feet, and the ridge that runs south from the summit is one of the most exposed and isolated stretches of terrain in the eastern mountains. I'd been hiking it since my late teens, drawn to the high-elevation spruce forest and the wind-stunted trees, and the views that on a clear day extend into Virginia and Maryland and make you feel like you're standing on the roof of the world. On a rainy day in October, which is when this happened, the ridge feels like something else entirely. The clouds come down and sit on the summit like a cap, and the visibility drops to almost nothing. G and the spruce trees disappear into the fog, and the whole landscape contracts to a circle of maybe 20 or 30 feet around you, beyond which everything is gray and wet and formless. It's beautiful in a way that edges toward unsettling, the kind of beauty that reminds you how small you are and how easily the world could swallow you without noticing. I was 29. I'd been doing a solo trip along the Allegheny Trail, a long-distance path that runs through the heart of the Monongahela National Forest, and I'd planned to camp on the ridge about a mile south of the summit, at a spot I'd used twice before where a flat shelf of ground offered enough space for a tarp and enough tree cover to break the worst of the wind. The rain had started around noon, not heavy at first, but steady, the kind of persistent drizzle that soaks through everything regardless of how well you've waterproofed and makes the trail a running stream of mud and leaf litter. By the time I reached my campsite around 4 in the afternoon, I was wet to the skin, and the fog had settled in to the point where I could barely see the edge of the ridge 20 feet from where I stood. I set up my tarp between two spruce trees, laid out my sleeping pad and bag, and got my camp stove going for dinner. Rice and dehydrated beans. Nothing special. The kind of meal you eat for calories rather than pleasure when you've been hiking in the rain all day, and the only thing that matters is getting something warm into your body. I ate under the tarp, sitting cross-legged on my sleeping pad, listening to the rain hit the nylon, and the wind push through the spruce, and the occasional drip of condensation falling from a branch to the forest floor, with a sound like a tiny drum. It was around 7 when my flashlight died. My primary light, a handheld LED that I'd been using for 3 years, flickered twice and went dark in the middle of my trying to organize my gear for the night. The batteries were new, replaced before the trip, but the switch had been getting unreliable for months, and I'd been putting off replacing the whole unit. I fished around in my pack for the backup, a smaller light that I kept in a Ziploc bag with spare batteries, and turned it on. The beam was narrower than my primary, more focused, a tight cone of white light that cut through the fog and rain like a laser, and illuminated whatever it touched with a harsh, bleached clarity. I swept the beam across the campsite the way you do when you first turn on a light in the dark, an instinctive survey of your surroundings. A quick confirmation that the world around you is the same world that was there when the lights went out. The beam traveled across the tarp, the pack, the stove, the nearest spruce trunks, and then, as I swung it south along the ridge, out into the fog and the rain and the dark that lay between my campsite and the next visible feature of the landscape, which was nothing, the beam touched something. 200 yards down the ridge, through layers of rain and fog that should have made anything at that distance invisible, a light came on. A single point of white, steady and unflickering, appeared at the exact instant my beam swept across its position. It was not a campfire. Campfires are orange, and they flicker, and they cast a diffuse glow that illuminates the surrounding area. This was sharp, clean, white. The size of a dime, at arm's length, precise and unwavering, like a flashlight pointed directly at me from a distance. I held my beam on the spot for maybe 2 seconds and then, reflexively, swung the light back toward my campsite. The instant my beam left the spot, the light vanished. Not gradually, not with a fade. It switched off, cleanly and completely, the way an electric light does when someone flips a switch. The ridge was dark again, just rain and fog, and the small circle of my tarp and the narrow beam of my backup flashlight pointed at my own boots. I pointed the beam back down the ridge. The light appeared. Same position, same intensity, same instant response, as if the light and my beam were connected by a circuit that closed when I looked and opened when I looked away. I moved the beam to the left. The light vanished. I moved it back to the position. The light reappeared. I moved it to the right. Gone. Back to center. There. Every test produced the same result. Immediate, precise, and synchronized with my beam, to a degree that eliminated coincidence or reflection, or any of the optical explanations I was constructing and discarding in rapid succession. I did this 6 times. 6 deliberate tests, pointing the beam at the spot and watching the light appear, moving the beam away and watching it vanish. 6 confirmations of a pattern that should not have existed. Whatever was producing that light was watching my beam. It was responding to my beam. It was matching my actions with the reflexive immediacy of a mirror, except mirrors don't produce their own light, and mirrors don't sit 200 yards away on a fog-shrouded ridge in the rain at 7 o'clock on an October evening. On the 7th test, I didn't move the beam. I pointed it at the spot, and I held it there, and the light appeared, and I kept the beam steady, and the light kept burning, and we stared at each other through the rain and the fog for approximately 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. I was sitting under my tarp with my backup flashlight gripped in both hands, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the weather, and at the end of that tunnel was a light that should not have been there, watching me, responding to me, holding steady with a patience that felt less like a phenomenon and more like a conversation. And then the light moved. Not suddenly, not with the jerky, startled motion of an animal or the quick repositioning of a person adjusting a flashlight. It moved slowly, steadily, toward me. The point of light began to close the distance between us, maintaining the same brightness, the same elevation, the same steady, unflickering quality, advancing along the ridge in my direction with the unhurried confidence of something that had been waiting. That was the word that arrived in my mind, uninvited and refused to leave. Waiting. The light had been waiting, sitting in the dark and the rain and the fog at a fixed point on the ridge, invisible, undetectable, until I swept my beam across it and gave it a reason to respond. My flashlight had found it, and now it was coming. For the first 5 seconds of its movement, I sat frozen. The analytical part of my brain was still trying to process what I was seeing, still running through explanations. Another camper, a ranger, an artifact of the fog playing tricks with light sources. But the deeper part, the part that operates below language and logic, and the comforting infrastructure of rational thought, had already made its assessment. It was wrong. Whatever was producing that light and moving it toward me through the rain was wrong in a way that bypassed every intellectual filter I had and went straight to the mechanism that tells a body when to run. I killed my flashlight. The darkness was immediate and absolute. The light down the ridge vanished at the same instant, as if our lights had been connected by a wire that I'd just cut. I sat in the dark under my tar, and I listened. Rain, wind, the dripping of the spruce. Nothing else. No footsteps, no sound of approach. Just the weather and the mountain and the silence where the light had been. I packed my camp in the dark. I did it by feel, my hands finding each item from memory and stuffing it into my pack with a speed that came from years of practice and a motivation that came from somewhere much older. Tarp down, sleeping pad rolled, bag stuffed, stove and fuel canister secured. I did it without a light because turning on a light would mean being seen, and being seen would mean being answered, and I did not want to be answered again. I hiked out in the dark, 2 miles of ridge trail in the pouring rain with no light, navigating by the feel of the trail under my boots and the occasional touch of a spruce branch against my arm telling me I'd drifted too close to the edge. The trail was a river of mud, and I slipped twice and fell once, catching myself on a root, and I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I didn't take out my flashlight. I walked with my eyes adjusted to the absolute dark, which in the fog and rain meant I could see almost nothing, and I followed the trail by memory and by the subtle differences in terrain that my feet could detect through the soles of my boots. The trailhead took 45 minutes to reach. My truck was the only vehicle in the gravel lot. I threw my pack in the bed, got behind the wheel, started the engine, and sat there with the headlights on and the heater blasting and the wipers sweeping the rain from the windshield. The lot was small, carved into the edge of the spruce forest, surrounded by dark trees on 3 sides and the gravel access road on the 4th. The headlights illuminated the trees and the rain and the fog, and nothing else. No light on the ridge, no point of white in the distance, no indication that anything was up there except the weather, the timber, and the empty trail I'd just walked. I drove back to Elkins, and I slept in my own bed, and I didn't go back to Spruce Knob for over a year. When I finally did, on a clear day in summer, I hiked to the spot where I'd been camped, and I looked south along the ridge to the position where the light had been. There was nothing there. Just the ridge, open and treeless for a stretch, then a knob of spruce and rock, then the trail continuing south into the distance. No structure, no reflective surface, no explanation for a steady white light at that position, at that elevation. I've told a few people about this. The responses range from ball lightning to another hiker to you were tired and the fog plays tricks. I accept all of these as possibilities. I'm not someone who insists on the supernatural when the natural hasn't been fully explored. But none of those explanations account for the responsiveness. The light didn't just appear. It appeared when I looked. It disappeared when I looked away. It matched my beam with the precision of a dance partner, and it held my gaze with the steadiness of something that was not only aware of me but interested in me. And when I held my light steady, when I stopped testing and simply looked, it took that as an invitation to approach. That's what stays with me, not the light itself but the interaction, the call and response. The sense that by sweeping my flashlight across the ridge, I had initiated a communication that I didn't understand and couldn't control. I'd sent a signal into the dark, and the dark had sent one back. And when I held the signal long enough, whatever received it decided the conversation was over, and it was time to close the distance between us. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't killed my light. I don't know what was moving toward me through the rain, but I know it was patient. I know it was precise. And I know it had been sitting in the dark on that ridge, lightless and invisible, waiting for someone to find it. Not waiting to be found, waiting for someone to look in its direction and permit it to look back. Because some things in these mountains don't move until they're seen. And once they're seen, they don't stop moving until they reach you. And the only defense I had, the only thing that saved me that night, was the decision to stop looking. To turn off the light, to walk 2 miles in the pouring rain in absolute darkness rather than give it one more second of my attention. Because attention is what it wanted. And attention, in the dark, on a ridge in the rain, is the most dangerous thing you can give. The Dolly Sods is not like other places in West Virginia. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say about any wilderness area they're trying to romanticize, but with the Sods, it's different. The plateau sits above 4,000 feet, a high-elevation landscape of wind-stunted spruce and open heath barrens and sphagnum bogs that looks more like northern Canada than the mid-Atlantic. The soil is thin and acidic, stained red by iron deposits that leach into the creeks and turn them the color of tea. The weather changes in minutes, fog rolling in from the west and erasing the landscape the way a hand wipes condensation from glass. People get lost up there regularly. Experienced hikers, people with GPS and topo maps, and years of backcountry travel, walk into the fog and come out miles from where they intended, disoriented by the sameness of the terrain and the way the spruce groves and open meadows repeat themselves in patterns that feel deliberate, as if the landscape is designed to circulate you rather than let you pass through. I'd been hiking the Sod since college. I knew the trails, knew the campsites, knew the particular way the wind sounds when it pushes through the spruce at elevation, a constant low moan that's not quite human and not quite mechanical and sits in your ears like tinnitus. I was comfortable there, in the way that you're comfortable in any place you've spent enough time to learn its rhythms. But comfort and familiarity are not the same thing as safety, and the Sods have a way of reminding you of that distinction when you least expect it. The trip was in mid-October of 2023. I drove up from Thomas on a Saturday morning, parked at the Bear Rocks trailhead, and hiked south along the Raven Ridge Trail under skies that were already thickening with the kind of low, gray overcast that means rain is coming and isn't going to stop once it starts. The forecast called for steady precipitation through the weekend, which would have discouraged most people but suited me fine. I prefer the Sods in bad weather. The day hikers stay home, the backcountry empties, and you get the plateau to yourself, which is the whole point. The campsite I was heading for was about 3 miles in, a clearing tucked against a stand of red spruce about a quarter mile off the main trail. I'd used it twice before. It was sheltered enough by the spruce to break the worst of the wind, and flat enough to pitch a tent without sleeping on a slope. The approach was through a meadow of blueberry bushes and heath grass that in October had turned a deep, rusty auburn, and the clearing itself was carpeted with spruce needles that made the ground soft and fragrant. The rain started about an hour before I reached the site. Light at first, a fine mist that coated everything with a sheen of water. Then heavier, a steady downpour that drummed on the hood of my rain jacket and turned the trail into a muddy channel. By the time I pushed through the last stand of spruce and stepped into the clearing, I was wet enough that the priority was shelter rather than scenery. That's when I saw the tent. It was small, a 2-person backpacking tent in a muted green that almost blended with the spruce behind it. It was set up properly, the kind of setup that comes from experience rather than guesswork. The rainfly taut and evenly tensioned, the guy lines staked at correct angles, the vestibule oriented away from the prevailing wind. It was positioned at the far end of the clearing, about 30 feet from where I would have put my own tent, tucked close to the tree line. I called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" My voice was swallowed by the rain and the spruce and the wind. No answer, no movement from inside the tent, no light, no shadow shifting behind the nylon. I walked closer and called again. Nothing. The tent was zipped shut, door and vestibule both sealed, and through the translucent fabric of the rainfly, I could see only the vague shapes of the inner tent walls, featureless and still. There were no boots in the vestibule, no pack leaning against the outside, no cooking gear, no water bottles, no trekking poles, None of the small artifacts that accumulate around an occupied campsite like evidence of habitation. I checked the trailhead parking lot when I arrived. 3 vehicles, including mine. One belonged to a couple I'd passed heading north on the trail, day hikers returning to their car. The other was a pickup truck with Virginia plates that could have belonged to a hunter or a fisherman and had nothing to do with this campsite. Nobody was parked at the trailhead who appeared to be on an overnight trip, and the tent looked like it had been here for a while. Not days, not weeks, but long enough that the ground beneath the vestibule showed the compressed soil of sustained weight, and a few spruce needles had accumulated on the rainfly in a pattern that suggested at least one windless night since the tent was pitched. I set up my own tent at the opposite end of the clearing, giving the green tent a wide berth that I told myself was courtesy but was closer to instinct. I cooked dinner under my vestibule, ate it watching the green tent through the rain, and cleaned up and crawled into my sleeping bag by 7. The rain intensified as the light faded, going from steady to heavy to the kind of sustained downpour that makes you grateful for a good rainfly and makes you wonder about anyone caught without one. Through the wall of my tent, I could see the green tent as a dark shape against the darker spruce, motionless and silent, its door still zipped, its interior still dark. I told myself someone was coming back, a hunter who'd set up a base camp and was out for the day, a hiker who'd cached their tent and gone to resupply. Any number of explanations that didn't require me to think about why a properly pitched tent was sitting empty in a backcountry clearing with no owner in sight. I fell asleep around 9. The rain was loud enough to fill every corner of my consciousness, and the exhaustion of the hike pulled me under quickly. I slept deeply and without dreams until approximately 1 in the morning, when a sound woke me with the specific, targeted precision of a noise that your sleeping brain recognizes as significant and escalates to consciousness. A zipper, the unmistakable metallic rattle of a tent zipper being pulled along its track. Not quickly, slowly, tooth by tooth, the way you unzip a tent when you're trying to be quiet, when you don't want to wake someone, when you're opening the door with the careful, deliberate patience of someone who has a reason not to make noise. It was coming from the green tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, and I listened. The zipper continued, a sustained metallic whisper that traveled from the bottom of the door to the top over the course of maybe 15 seconds. Then it stopped. The door was open. I could tell because the quality of the sound from that direction changed, the rain hitting the tent differently now that the vestibule was open, a shift in the acoustic signature that told me the sealed space had become an open one. I moved to the mesh window on the side of my tent that faced the clearing. The green tent was visible as a darker shape in the dark, maybe 30 feet away, and the door flap was hanging open, not pulled back and secured the way you'd open a tent to air it out, just hanging, a dark rectangle of interior space exposed to the rain. Nobody came out. Nobody stood in the doorway. Nobody moved. The opening was just there, gaping at the night, and from inside it, I could hear something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the warmth of my sleeping bag. Wet fabric is being moved, rearranged. The sound of nylon sliding against nylon, slow and deliberate, the way you'd hear a sleeping bag being unrolled, or a rain jacket being spread flat, or clothing being folded and unfolded and smoothed out on the floor of a tent. It was methodical, unhurried. The sounds of someone preparing a space, making room, arranging an interior for a purpose I couldn't see and didn't want to imagine. The movements had a domesticity to them that was worse than any aggressive sound could have been. They were the sounds of someone settling in, getting comfortable, making a place ready. I watched the open door of the green tent for the rest of the night. The rearranging sounds continued for maybe 20 minutes and then stopped, and the tent fell silent, its open door a dark mouth in the side of the clearing that neither closed nor produced anything else. The rain fell into it. The wind pushed the door flap slightly. Nothing emerged. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with my headlamp in my hand, and I watched the green tent, and I listened to the rain, and I waited for dawn with the particular, rigid patience of a person who has decided that the only safe action is inaction. At some point, in the deepest part of the night, around 3 or 4, I became aware of a smell. Faint, carried on the damp air that moved between the two tents. A scent I couldn't immediately identify, but that produced a visceral, involuntary response, a tightening in my throat and a contraction in my stomach. It was organic, human, not decay, not blood, nothing that dramatic. It was the smell of a body, of skin and hair, and the particular chemical signature that a living person produces when they've been in a confined space for a long time. It was coming from the direction of the green tent, carried to me on the rain-wet air through the open door, and it was wrong in a way that I felt rather than analyzed. Not the wrongness of something dead, the wrongness of something present that shouldn't have been. Dawn came slowly, the rain eased to a drizzle. The sky lightened from black to charcoal to gray, and the clearing materialized around me in increments. The spruce first, then the heath, then the ground, then the green tent, still open, still silent, its door flapped dark with rain and hanging limp against the nylon. I packed my camp. I did it methodically, rolling my sleeping bag, deflating my pad, breaking down the tent poles, and stuffing everything into my pack with the focused efficiency of someone who wants to leave and wants to do it properly, and does not want to rush, because rushing would mean admitting that I was afraid, and I wasn't ready to admit that yet. When my pack was loaded and my sight was clean, I walked across the clearing to the green tent. The door was still open. I stood at the vestibule and looked inside. The tent was empty. No sleeping bag, no pad, no gear of any kind. The interior was bare nylon, the floor of the tent pressed flat against the ground, and the only contents were what the night had deposited through the open door. A misting of rain on the fabric, a few spruce needles blown in by the wind. And in the center of the tent floor, arranged with a precision that was immediately, undeniably deliberate, was a pile of clothing. A flannel shirt, green and brown plaid, a pair of jeans, dark denim, men's, maybe a 32 waist, a pair of wool socks, gray, rolled together, a cotton undershirt, white, folded in thirds, and a pair of boots, leather hiking boots, worn and muddy, placed side by side at the edge of the pile with the laces tucked inside. The clothing was folded with care, each piece creased and squared and stacked with the attention you'd give to laundry you were putting away in a drawer. It was soaking wet, every piece saturated with rain, the fabric dark and heavy with water, and it was warm. I know because I touched the flannel shirt. I reached down and put my hand on it, and the warmth came through the wet fabric like a pulse, the residual heat of a body that had been wearing these clothes recently, very recently, within the last hour, within the last few minutes, the heat of skin still trapped in the fibers and radiating outward through the rain and the cold. Someone had been wearing these clothes. Someone had taken them off in the tent, defolded them neatly, placed them on the floor, and left, into the rain, into the dark, into the dolly sods in October without clothing, boots, or gear of any kind. And the clothing was still warm, which meant they hadn't gone far, which meant they might still be close, standing in the spruce, or the heath, or the fog, barefoot and bare-skinned, watching me crouch at the door of the green tent and touch the flannel shirt they'd folded with such careful, terrible precision. I stood up. I stepped back from the tent. I looked at the clearing and the spruce and the heath and the fog that was already building in the low places as the morning warmed. Nothing. Nobody. Just the plateau and the wind and the rain and the two tents, mine empty and packed, theirs empty and open, and the warm clothing on the floor that had no owner and no explanation. I hiked out in 45 minutes, moving fast, not running but not stopping either, my pack bouncing on my back and my boots splashing through the puddles on the trail. At the trailhead, the parking lot held the same 3 vehicles, including the Virginia pickup that still sat where it had been the day before. I looked at it more closely this time. The bed was empty. The cab was locked. On the passenger seat, visible through the window, was a Dolly Sods trail map, folded open to the section that included the campsite where I'd spent the night. A campsite was circled in pen. My campsite. I drove home. I called the Randolph County Sheriff's Office from my apartment in Thomas and reported what I'd found. A tent, empty, with warm clothing inside. A vehicle at the trailhead with no apparent owner. The dispatcher took the information and said they'd send someone to check. I don't know if they did. I don't know if they found the tent or the clothing. I don't know if anyone ever came back for the Virginia pickup, or if it sat in that lot until someone towed it. I've been back to the Dolly Sods since then. I've even hiked past the clearing where the green tent was. It's gone now. The site is empty, the ground recovered, the spruce standing silent and indifferent. But I don't camp there. I don't camp anywhere on the sods anymore. Because the thing I can't stop thinking about isn't the tent or the clothing or the zipper opening at 1 in the morning. It's the warmth. The clothing was warm. Whoever had been wearing it had taken it off moments before I found it. They had folded it with care, each piece squared and stacked, the boots placed side by side, the socks rolled, the shirt creased. They had performed this act of domestic orderliness in a bare tent in the rain, in the dark, on a high-elevation plateau in October. And then they had stepped out of the tent and into the night, wearing nothing and carrying nothing, and walking barefoot into a landscape that at that temperature and that elevation would kill an unclothed person in hours. And they had done it quietly enough that I hadn't heard them leave. Quietly enough that the only sound was the zipper and the fabric, and then silence and warmth. Warmth that shouldn't have been there and was. Warmth that stayed in the clothing like a goodbye. Like a note left on a kitchen table by someone who isn't coming back. Like the last physical evidence that a person existed before the mountain took them. Claire and I had been together about 2 years when this happened. We'd met through mutual friends in Charleston, bonded over a shared love of the outdoors, and built our relationship around the kind of weekend adventures that people in West Virginia take for granted, but that people from anywhere else would consider ambitious. Kayaking the New River, mountain biking in the Canaan Valley, backpacking sections of the Allegheny Trail, and camping, always camping. Claire had grown up in a family that spent every vacation in a tent, and she brought to the activity a competence and an ease that made her the better outdoors person of the two of us, though she was gracious enough never to say so. The Gauley River spot was one of our favorites. It was on a stretch of the river in Webster County, downstream from the Summersville Dam, accessible by a dirt road that followed the river for about 3 miles, before dead-ending at a pull-off where you could park and walk 100 yards through the woods to a wide gravel bar on the inside of a bend. The bar was maybe 50 yards long and 20 yards wide at its broadest point, a shelf of smooth river stones that sloped gently toward the water's edge and offered enough flat ground for a tent and a fire ring. The river at that point was wide and relatively shallow, running clear over a bed of sandstone and gravel with the kind of steady, musical current that makes you forget that the same water can become a killing force when the conditions change. We'd camped there twice before without incident, both times in summer, both times in dry weather, both times with the river running at a level that was shin-deep at the crossing and manageable for wading. We knew the spot, we were comfortable with it. And when we drove out on a Friday evening in late September of 2023, planning to spend 2 nights by the river, the forecast showed a chance of light rain overnight with clearing by morning. Nothing that would have given us pause. Nothing suggested the kind of night we were about to have. We arrived around 5 in the afternoon and set up camp at the upstream end of the gravel bar, close enough to the water that we could hear the current from the tent, but far enough up the slope that we had a comfortable margin. The tent was a 3-season backpacking tent, good quality, large enough for 2 people and their gear. We cooked dinner on the camp stove, sat by the fire as the sun dropped behind the ridge, and watched the river turn from gold to silver to black as the light left the valley. The rain started around sunset, a gentle patter that barely registered against the sound of the current. We cleaned up, doused the fire, and crawled into the tent around 9. The rain on the fly was a lullaby. We fell asleep holding hands. I woke up at 2 in the morning to a sound that took me several seconds to identify because it was so far outside the context of what I expected to hear. Water. Moving fast. Not the gentle current of the Gauley at base flow, but a rushing, churning torrent that sounded like a highway, a continuous roar of water displacing air and carrying stones and branches and everything else in its path. I sat up in the tent, reached for my headlamp, turned it on, and immediately saw the problem. The ground beneath the tent was wet, not damp from condensation, wet. Water was seeping through the gravel from the direction of the river, saturating the ground cloth, turning the floor of the tent into a shallow pool that was deepening as I watched. I unzipped the door and looked out. Tea in my stomach dropped. The river had risen, not gradually, not by the slow inches of a normal overnight swell, but dramatically, violently, the water level climbing 3 feet or more while we slept. The edge of the current was less than 10 feet from our tent, advancing across the gravel bar with a speed that meant the gradient between the rising river and our campsite was about to reach zero. In minutes, not hours, the water would be at the tent, and the current was moving at a speed that would carry anything it touched downstream without hesitation. I grabbed Claire's shoulder. She was already awake, already registering the sound and the wet floor and the fear in my voice. We didn't speak. We moved. I grabbed the car keys and the first aid kit. Claire grabbed her boots and my jacket. We left everything else. The tent, the sleeping bags, the packs, the stove, the food. We unzipped the door and stepped out into the rain and the dark and the roar of the river, and we scrambled up the bank behind the gravel bar, climbing the steep, root-laced slope on hands and knees, pulling ourselves upward through the underbrush until we reached a shelf of rock about 20 feet above the river level. From there, we watched. The headlamp was still on, and its beam cut through the rain and showed us the gravel bar disappearing. The water reached the tent within 3 minutes of our leaving it. It didn't approach gently. It came in a front, a leading edge of brown water carrying foam and debris that hit the tent like a wall and folded it flat. The fabric collapsed under the weight of the current, the poles snapping, the fly tearing free, and within seconds the whole structure was moving, tumbling downstream in the flood, tangling in the current with our sleeping bags and our packs and everything we'd left behind. It was gone in less than a minute. The gravel bar where we'd been sleeping was underwater, the river running smooth and unbroken across the space as if it had never been dry. We found the rock overhang by Feel, a shallow concavity in the hillside about 6 feet deep and 3 feet tall, large enough for 2 people to sit pressed against the back wall with their knees up and the rain dripping off the lip above. We sat there, and we shivered, and we watched the river, and we didn't talk because there was nothing to say that the sound of the water wasn't already saying. The rain continued, the river continued to rise, and the world contracted to the small dark space of the overhang, and the two of us, and the roar. I don't know exactly when we saw it. Time moved strangely that night, the hours distorted by cold and fear, and the constant sensory assault of the rain and the river. It was sometime after 3, maybe closer to 4, when the sky had begun to show the faintest suggestion of lightning behind the clouds to the east. Claire grabbed my arm. Her grip was sudden and hard, her fingers digging into my bicep with a force that startled me. She didn't speak. She just pointed. In the river. In the middle of the current, roughly where the center of the gravel bar would have been if the gravel bar still existed. Something was standing. I say standing because that's what it was doing. Not floating, not being carried by the current, not bobbing or drifting or tumbling the way debris does when it's caught in floodwater. Standing, upright, stationary, in water that was moving at a speed I'd estimate at 10 or 15 miles per hour, fast enough to carry full-size trees downstream, fast enough to kill a person in seconds. Something was standing waist-deep and motionless, oriented toward the bank where our campsite had been, as if the flood was nothing more than a breeze. The headlamp was off. We were in the dark under the overhang, watching by whatever light the cloud-covered sky provided, which was almost none. But the river had a sheen to it, a reflective quality from the rain hitting the surface, and against that sheen the shape was visible as a dark vertical interruption in the horizontal flow of water. It was solid, defined. It had the proportions of a person from the waist up, a torso, shoulders, a head, visible above the waterline with the stability of something anchored to the riverbed. The current broke around it the way current breaks around a bridge piling, parting at the upstream side and rejoining downstream, creating a visible wake that I could see even in the... It was facing us. Or rather, it was facing the bank, the spot where our tent had been. The gravel bar was now 3 feet underwater. It stood there, and it didn't move, and the river roared around it, and the rain fell on it, and it was as still as stone. I watched it for 10 minutes. Claire watched it beside me, her hand still gripping my arm, her breathing fast and shallow, the fine tremor in her body that came from cold and fear in equal measure. Neither of us spoke. Speaking would have meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have meant accepting that what we were seeing was real, that something was standing in the middle of a flooded river in the dark, immovable, facing the place where we had been sleeping an hour earlier, with an attention that felt personal. It sank. That's the word that fits, though it doesn't capture the strangeness of the movement. After approximately 10 minutes of absolute stillness, the shape began to descend, straight down, not tilting, not falling, not being pushed by the current, sinking vertically, as if the riverbed had opened beneath it, or as if it were being drawn downward by a force acting from below. The head went under last, disappearing beneath the surface, with the slow, controlled descent of an elevator, and the water closed over the spot without turbulence, without a ripple, without any indication that anything had been there. One moment, it was standing in the river. Next, the river was empty, and the current flowed smooth and unbroken, and the rain fell on the surface, and there was nothing. Claire's grip on my arm didn't relax for another hour. We sat under the overhang until dawn came gray, and reluctant through the clouds, and the rain eased to a drizzle, and the river, though still high, began to show the first signs of receding. In the pale morning light, the valley looked washed and damaged. The banks scoured, debris tangled in the tree branches that hung over the water, the gravel bar still submerged, but visible as a lighter patch beneath the surface. The spot where the shape had been standing was indistinguishable from the rest of the river, just water, moving downstream the way water is supposed to move, obeying physics and gravity, and every natural law that what we'd seen had quietly, completely violated. We hiked out at first light. The trail back to the car was muddy and littered with fallen branches, and at one point we had to wade through a section where a tributary had overflowed and covered the path in 6 inches of brown water. Neither of us mentioned what we'd seen. Not during the hike, not during the drive back to Charleston, not that evening, or the next day, or the day after that. The silence built between us like a wall, not hostile but structural, a barrier we both recognize. And neither of us tried to breach. Claire told me 3 weeks later that it was a tree trunk, she said, lodged in the riverbed, visible above the surface, dislodged by the current and carried away. It was a tree, she said, and her voice was steady, why, and her eyes were clear, and she said it with the conviction of someone who has chosen an explanation and committed to it fully, not because it's true, but because the alternative is unlivable. I said okay. I didn't argue. I didn't point out that trees don't stand upright in floodwater, that trees don't face specific directions. Those trees don't sink straight down without leaving a ripple. I just said okay, why, and we never talked about it again. We broke up 4 months later, not because of the river, or not directly. The distance that settled between us after that night never fully closed, a gap in the intimacy of our relationship that neither of us could bridge, because bridging it would have required talking about the thing we'd agreed not to talk about. We just drifted apart, the way people do when a shared experience that should have brought them closer pushes them into separate silences instead. I still camp. I still go to the rivers in Webster County, the hollows in Nicholas County, and the ridges in Randolph County, but I don't camp on gravel bars anymore, and I don't camp near the gully. And on rainy nights, when the water is high and the current is fast, then the surface of the river catches the last light of the sky and reflects it in that flat, metallic sheen. I don't look too closely, because some things stand in rivers that shouldn't be able to stand in rivers, and some things watch from the water the way we watch from the bank. And the only difference between them and us is that we can leave and they can't, or they choose not to, or they're waiting for something, standing in the current with a patience that outlasts the flood and the rain and the night, facing the bank where someone was sleeping, watching the place where a tent used to be, and sinking slowly back into the river when the dawn comes, not because the light drives them away, but because they've seen enough. For now, they've seen enough for now. The Cranberry Wilderness is one of the few places in West Virginia where you can hike for an entire day without crossing a road, or seeing a building, or encountering any evidence that the 21st century exists. It's about 35,000 acres of unbroken forest in Pocahontas and Webster counties, a roadless expanse of spruce and hardwood and rhododendron that fills the high valleys and ridges between the Cranberry and Williams rivers with a density that makes navigation without a map and compass genuinely difficult. The trails are minimal, many of them old logging grades that have been reclaimed by the forest to the point where they're more suggestion than path, and the campsites are wherever you can find flat ground and clean water. It's the kind of place that rewards self-sufficiency and punishes overconfidence, and I loved it for both of those qualities. I was 26 and working as a wildland firefighter based out of Richwood. The off-season was long, and the pay was seasonal. Elle and I filled the empty months with backcountry trips that served as both training and therapy, keeping my body in condition and my mind in the kind of quiet that only exists when you're miles from anyone who knows your name. The Cranberry was my home ground. I'd hiked every trail in the wilderness at least twice and bushwhacked most of the ridges between them. I knew the drainages and the watersheds and the places where the rhododendron grew so thick you'd need a machete to move through it. I knew the weather patterns, the way storms built from the west and stalled over the high terrain and dumped rain for days. I knew the wilderness, the way you know a room in your own house, by feel as much as by sight, and that familiarity gave me a confidence that in retrospect may have been the problem. The trip was supposed to be 3 days. I went in on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, parking at the Cranberry Campground trailhead and hiking south along the Williams River Trail toward the headwaters. The plan was to camp 2 nights near the river's source, a boggy meadow at about 4,000 feet, where the water emerges from springs in the hillside and gathers into a stream that eventually becomes one of the best native brook trout rivers in the state. It was a spot I'd been to 3 times before, remote enough that I'd never seen another person there, and beautiful in the austere, high-elevation way that mountain meadows are beautiful in October. All gold grass and dark spruce, and the smell of cold water and decaying leaves. The rain started on the first afternoon. Not the scattered showers the forecast had suggested, but a steady, soaking rain that set in with the permanence of a system that had nowhere else to be. By the time I reached the headwaters meadow and set up camp, the trail behind me was a stream, and the meadow was turning into a shallow lake. In the sky was a uniform gray from horizon to horizon. I pitched my tent on the highest ground I could find, a slight rise at the edge of the meadow where the spruce began, and strung my tarp over the vestibule to create a sheltered space where I could cook and sit without being inside the tent. The rain hammered the tarp and the tent and the meadow and the forest with a constancy that became almost meditative. There's a point where rain is so continuous that it stops being weather and becomes environment, a permanent condition rather than a passing event, and this rain reached that point within the first hour. I spent the afternoon in the tent, reading, dozing, listening. The rain on nylon is a sound that can put you to sleep or keep you awake, depending on your state of mind. And my state of mind was somewhere between peaceful and lonely. The particular emotional temperature of being completely alone in a place so remote that if something went wrong, nobody would know for days. I thought about that more than I usually did on solo trips. The isolation felt heavier than normal, weighted by the rain and the gray light and the knowledge that the trail I'd come in on was probably impassable by now. The creek crossings swollen, the muddy sections turned to bogs. I was committed. Whatever happened, I was here until the rain stopped and the water receded and the trails became walkable again. I fell asleep around 9. The rain was my lullaby and my white noise machine, filling the tent with a steady hiss that drowned out the smaller sounds of the forest and created a cocoon of sonic isolation that was almost womb-like in its completeness. I slept deeply. No dreams that I remember. Just the darkness and the rain and the slow drift of unconsciousness that claims you when your body is tired and your mind has nothing left to process. I woke at dawn. The tent was filled with a gray half-light that told me the sun was up behind the clouds even if I couldn't see it. The rain was still falling, lighter now but persistent, a steady drizzle that pattered on the rainfly with the quiet regularity of a clock. I was lying on my back in my sleeping bag, warm and dry, not yet ready to face the cold and wet of another day pinned down by weather. I was looking at the ceiling of the tent and listening to the rain and feeling the particular inertia of a morning when there's no reason to get up and no one to get up for. The zipper moved. I heard it before I saw it. That distinctive metallic sound, the whisper of a nylon zipper slider being drawn along its track, tooth by tooth, the tiny clicking of each coil engaging and releasing as the slider advanced. It was coming from the door of the tent. The main entry, which I'd zipped fully closed the night before, from the inside, pulling the slider from the bottom of the door to the top and tucking the pull tab under a small fold of fabric to keep it from sliding back down. The zipper was now moving in the opposite direction. From the outside, down from the top, where I'd secured it, toward the bottom of the door. Slowly, very slowly, one tooth at a time, with a pace that suggested not mechanical failure or wind or any external force, but deliberation, intention, the unhurried patience of something that was opening my tent from the outside and wanted to take its time doing it. I turned my head and looked at the door. The slider was visible in the gray light, a small dark shape against the lighter fabric of the door panel, and it was descending. I could see it move, a fraction of an inch, then a pause, then another fraction. The sound accompanied each advancement, that quiet metallic whisper, and through the narrow gap that was opening between the two halves of the zipper, I could see the outside world. The gray-green of the forest floor, the dark shapes of spruce trunks. The rain hits the mud, the leaf litter, and the ground sheet of the vestibule. No hand, no fingers on the pull tab, no shadow of a person crouching at the door. The slider was moving by itself, drawn downward along the track by a force I couldn't see and couldn't explain. I lay in my sleeping bag, and I watched it descend with a paralysis that wasn't fear exactly, but something closer to fascination, the suspended state of a mind encountering something that its framework cannot accommodate. Zippers don't move by themselves. They are mechanical devices that require physical force applied to a pull tab in a specific direction. Wind can't do it. Rain can't do it. Gravity can work on a slider, but only if the tent is angled correctly. And my tent was level. I'd checked. And the slider was moving against gravity, downward, on a vertical zipper face, where gravity would have pulled it toward the bottom only if it were already at the top, which it was, but the force required to initiate the movement was not something gravity could provide without a trigger. 6 inches of the door were open, 8, a foot. The gap widened, and the rain came through it in a fine mist that touched my sleeping bag, and my face with a coldness that confirmed this was real, that the door was actually opening, that the barrier between the inside of my tent and the outside world was being removed by something that stood or crouched or existed just beyond the threshold. The smell came with the rain, wet earth which was expected, cold air which was expected, and something else, something faintly sweet and faintly organic, like the smell of flowers that have been in a vase too long and the water has turned, that particular scent of vegetable decay that's not quite rot but is well past freshness. It came through the opening in the door and filled the tent with a presence that was olfactory rather than visual, a signature of something near that produced this smell or carried it or was made of whatever process created it. The zipper continued, 18 inches open, 2 feet. The door flap was falling away from the frame now, sagging under its own weight and the weight of the rain collecting on its surface, creating an opening wide enough that I could see a broad swath of the campsite beyond. The meadow, gray and waterlogged. The spruce, dark and dripping. The rain falls on everything with the same steady, indifferent constancy. And nothing else. Nobody. No shape at the door. No silhouette against the tree line. No boots on the ground. No knees in the mud. No indication of any physical presence that could account for the open zipper and the advancing slider. When the slider reached the bottom of the track, the door flap fell fully open, and the tent became a shelter rather than an enclosure, a 3-walled space exposed to the elements on the 4th side. The rain blew in across the vestibule and onto my sleeping bag and onto my face, and I lay there, and I looked out at the cranberry wilderness in the gray dawn light, and I listened. The rain, the drip of the spruce, the distant sound of the swollen creek, and underneath those sounds, so quiet I might have imagined it, a breathing, not from any direction, not from outside or inside or above or below, from the air itself, from the space where the door used to be, as if the act of opening the tent had created a channel through which something could exhale into my space, could release a single, sustained breath that carried the sweet wrong smell and the cold and the particular quality of attention that tells you, without any visual confirmation, that you are being observed. I got out of the sleeping bag. I put on my boots. I packed my camp in the rain with hands that shook not from cold, but from the sustained adrenaline of a nervous system that had been in a state since the first click of the zipper. I packed everything, Sleeping bag, pad, stove, food, tarp, every item stuffed into my pack with an efficiency born of urgency rather than care. I broke down the tent last. When I pulled up the stakes and collapsed the poles and rolled the nylon into its stuff sack, the sweet smell was strongest near the door, concentrated in the fabric around the zipper track, as if whatever had touched the slider had left a residue on the nylon. I hiked out, 9 miles through the rain, on trails that were rivers of mud and creek crossings that were waist deep, and rhododendron tunnels where the branches grabbed my pack and my arms and my legs, as if the forest itself was trying to hold me in place. I didn't stop. 9 miles in 4 hours, a pace that under normal conditions would have been uncomfortable, and under these conditions was punishing. My boots filling with water, my legs burning, my lungs aching from the cold air and the exertion. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead and my truck and the gravel road that led to the paved road that led to Richwood, and the motel where I spent the next 2 nights in a room with a deadbolt and a television and walls that didn't breathe. I still have the tent. I've used it since, on trips closer to civilization, on nights when the weather is clear, and the campsite is shared, and the loneliness factor is low enough that I feel safe in the outdoors the way I used to feel safe before the cranberry. But the zipper has never worked properly since that morning. It sticks. It catches. At a specific point on the track, about 12 inches from the bottom, the slider resists and stutters and requires extra force to push past, as if the teeth at that spot have been deformed or the track has been bent. Or something in the mechanism remembers. I've examined the zipper under good light. There's nothing visibly wrong with it. The teeth are aligned, the track is straight, the slider is clean. But it catches at that point every time, the exact point where the zipper was open to when I woke up, the exact point where the gap between inside and outside was wide enough to admit the smell and the rain and the breath of whatever opened my tent at dawn in the headwaters of the Williams River. I've shown the zipper to people. They tell me it's worn out. They tell me zippers fail. They tell me the call, the moisture, or the age of the tent has degraded the mechanism. They're probably right. But the zipper worked perfectly before that morning and has stuck at the same point ever since. And the coincidence is precise enough that I can't dismiss it the way I'd like to. Because the zipper doesn't just stick, it stops. The same way it stopped that morning when the door had opened enough to let something in. As if the track has a memory. As if the mechanism recorded the moment it was used by something other than my hands and preserved that moment in its operation, a permanent hesitation at the point where the door was open just wide enough, not for me to leave, for something else to enter. And every time I use that tent, every time the slider catches and sticks and I have to force it past that point, I'm reminded that something touched this zipper in the rain in the cranberry wilderness. And the zipper has never forgotten, and neither have I. My Uncle Ray owns about 60 acres of wooded hillside in Raleigh County that runs from the Ridge Road where his house sits down to the rim of the New River Gorge. He's had the land since the 70s, bought it with money he earned working at the chemical plant in Bell before it closed, and he's done nothing with most of it except let it grow. The upper portion near the house is cleared, a few acres of grass where he keeps a garden and parks his equipment, but everything below the first 100 yards of slope is forest. A dense mix of oak and poplar and hemlock that drops steeply toward the gorge rim and the river 1,000 feet below. Ray uses the lower section for hunting in deer season and occasionally lets family members camp there when they ask. But otherwise it sits undisturbed, a private wilderness at the edge of a public one, connected to the vast forested expanse of the New River Gorge National Park by nothing more than a fence line that the trees have long since absorbed. My brother Kevin and I asked Ray if we could camp there over a weekend in October of 2023. We'd been talking about doing a brother's trip for months. Something simple, no agenda, just a night in the woods with a fire and some beers, and the kind of conversation that 2 men in their 30s can only seem to have when they're away from their wives and their jobs, and the daily noise that makes real talking difficult. Ray said sure, told us the best spot was about a quarter-mile downhill from the ridge, where the slope leveled off briefly before dropping again toward the gorge. There was a flat area there, he said, with a natural clearing and a fire ring that somebody had built years ago from creek stones. He said we'd know it when we found it. We hiked in on a Saturday afternoon, carrying our packs down a path that Ray had cut through the underbrush and that the forest was steadily reclaiming. The trees closed in quickly once we left the cleared area, the canopy thickening until the sky was reduced to fragments of gray visible through the branches. The clearing was exactly where Ray said it would be. A flat shelf of ground, maybe 40 feet across, shaded by old oaks, with the fire ring in the center. The ring was well built, a circle of flat creek stones about 3 feet in diameter, stacked 2 courses high and filled with ash and charcoal from previous fires that could have been months or decades old. It looked like it had been there a long time. The stones were darkened with soot and settled into the ground with the permanence of fixtures. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing, Kevin's near the uphill edge, and mine closer to the downhill side, where the slope resumed its descent toward the gorge. The rain had been intermittent all day, on and off in cycles that gave us just enough dry time to get camp established before the next round arrived. We built a fire in the ring using wood we gathered from the surrounding forest, mostly dead oak and some poplar, and cooked dinner over the flames as the light faded and the rain came back in earnest. By 8 o'clock, the fire was struggling. The rain was steady now, not a downpour but persistent enough that the wood we'd stacked beside the ring was getting soaked through, and the flames kept sputtering and hissing as droplets found their way past the canopy. By then, we'd given up. The fire was reduced to a smoking pile of wet wood and gray ash that produced more steam than heat, and we decided to call it a night. Kevin doused what was left with water from his bottle, more out of habit than necessity since the rain was doing the job, and we retreated to our tents. I fell asleep listening to the rain. It was a comfortable sound in that setting, steady and enveloping, the kind of white noise that makes a tent feel smaller and more secure than it actually is. Kevin's tent was about 25 feet from mine, close enough that I could hear him shifting in his sleeping bag and the occasional muffled sound of him talking to himself, a habit he's had since childhood that he claims he's not aware of. The clearing was dark, the forest was dark, the fire was dead, and the rain fell on everything equally. I woke up around midnight. Not gradually, not from a sound, at least not immediately. I woke up because of a smell. Smoke. Not the stale, waterlogged smell of our dead campfire, the sour scent of wet ash and charcoal that lingers after a fire is drowned. This was different. This was fresh. The sharp, bright smell of green wood catching flame, of sap bubbling and bark curling, and the volatile compounds in fresh timber being released by heat. It was the smell of a fire that had just been started, the opening minutes of combustion when the wood is still resisting, and the smoke is white and thick and carries the full chemical signature of the material being burned. I unzipped the door of my tent about 6 inches and looked out. The fire ring was burning, not smoldering, not glowing with residual embers that the rain had failed to extinguish. Burning. Full flame, 2 feet high, crackling and popping with the energetic sound of a well-built fire at its peak, the kind of fire that takes dry wood and good airflow, and at least 20 minutes of patient tending to achieve. The flames were bright enough to illuminate the entire clearing, casting orange light on the oak trunks and the tent walls and the underside of the canopy above, and the fire was burning as if the rain didn't exist. And it was raining. Steadily, visibly, drops hit the ground around the fire ring, and the surfaces of our tents, and the leaves of the trees with the constant patter I'd fallen asleep to. The rain was hitting the fire too. I could see the drops entering the light and hitting the flames, but it wasn't affecting them. The fire burned through the rain the way a fire burns in a fireplace, hot and contained and utterly indifferent to the moisture falling on it. I stared at it. The wood in the ring was not the wood we'd left there. Our failed fire had been a pile of waterlogged oak and poplar, stacked loosely and drowned by the rain. What was burning now looked different, darker wood, arranged in a tight structure, a teepee of branches that had been placed with the deliberate architecture of someone who knew how to build a fire that would catch and sustain. I hadn't built this fire. Kevin hadn't built this fire. We'd been in our tents for 3 hours, and the fire had been dead when we left it, and now it was burning with a strength and a stability that I couldn't explain. I looked at Kevin's tent. The door was partially unzipped, and I could see his face in the gap, lit by the firelight, his eyes wide and fixed on the flames. He was awake. He'd seen it too. We looked at each other across the clearing in the orange light, and neither of us said a word. What would we have said? The fire was burning. It shouldn't have been burning, and saying that out loud wouldn't have changed it. We watched it for approximately 30 minutes. The fire burned with a consistency that fires don't normally maintain. No fluctuation in intensity, no dying back, no flare-ups from pockets of sap or shifting logs. Just steady, constant flame, burning in the rain as if the rain were fuel rather than suppressant. The wood crackled and popped, and the sparks rose into the canopy. And the smoke went straight up in a column that the rain couldn't bend. I could feel the heat from 20 feet away. Real heat. The kind that dries your face and makes your eyes sting. Not a hallucination or an optical illusion, but a genuine fire producing genuine warmth in a clearing, where an hour earlier, everything was cold and wet and dead. And then it went out. Not the way fires go out. Not gradually. Not with the slow diminishment of flame to ember to ash that every fire follows as it exhausts its fuel. It went out the way a light goes out when you flip a switch. Instantaneously. Every flame extinguished at the same moment, the entire fire going from full burn to absolute darkness in less than a second. The clearing plunged into black. The only light was the dim gray of the overcast sky visible through the canopy. The only sound was the rain. I sat in the door of my tent, and I stared at the place where the fire had been, and I breathed, and I waited for my eyes to adjust. When they did, after maybe 2 minutes of darkness, I could see the fire ring as a dark circle in the center of the clearing. No glow, no ember, no trace of residual heat producing even the faintest red point in the ash. The fire was not just out, it was cold. I know, because I eventually checked, though it took me another 20 minutes to work up the nerve to leave the tent. I walked to the fire ring with my headlamp on. Kevin walked with me, having emerged from his tent without speaking, and we stood side by side and looked down at the ring. The ash was cold. I put my hand over it, palm down, the way you check a fire to make sure it's safe, and felt nothing. No warmth, no heat rising. The ash was the same temperature as the rain falling on it. It felt like it had been dead for hours. Like the fire we'd watched burning for 30 minutes had left no thermal trace in the stones, or the soil, or the air above it. The stones. That's what made Kevin take a step back. That's what made me crouch down and look more closely and feel something in my chest go tight. Around the perimeter of the fire ring, arranged in a circle on top of the stacked stone wall, were small rocks. Not the creek stones that made up the ring itself. These were smaller, palm-sized, smooth and flat, the kind of stones you'd find at the bottom of a creek bed, worn by water into oval discs. There were 12 of them, evenly spaced around the ring at intervals so precise they could have been measured with a ruler. Each one was placed flat side up, balanced on the uneven surface of the ring wall with a stability that required intention. They hadn't fallen there. They hadn't been washed into position by the rain. They had been placed, deliberately, by hands that had arranged them with care while Kevin and I watched a fire burn that shouldn't have been burning. I counted them 3 times. 12. Kevin counted them separately and got the same number. We looked at each other in the headlamp light and the rain and the dark, and we had the same conversation without words that we'd been having all night. The fire, the stones, the absence of explanation, the presence of something that had been in this clearing while we watched and had done things that we saw the results of, but not the doing. We packed our camps in the dark. We hiked up the hill to the ridge road using our headlamps and the path and arrived at Kevin's truck around 3 in the morning. We drove to a diner in Beckley that was open 24 hours. And we sat in a booth and drank coffee, and we talked about it for the first and last time. Kevin said maybe the fire wasn't completely out when we went to bed. And the rain eased enough for it to rekindle. I asked about the stones. He said maybe they were already there, and we hadn't noticed. I asked about the way the fire went out, all at once, every flame simultaneously. He didn't have an answer for that. He stirred his coffee and looked at the table and said some things don't have an explanation. Essen, trying to find one just makes you feel worse. We told our Uncle Ray the following week. We described the fire and the stones and the way it all ended. Ray listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his face showing nothing but the patient attention of a man who has lived in these mountains his whole life and has heard things that the rest of us would dismiss. When we finished, He was quiet for a long time. Then he said his grandmother, a woman named Aura who had lived to 96 and had spent her entire life within 10 miles of this property, used to say that the section of woods where we'd camped had been a meeting place. She said it had been used for gatherings long before the family owned the land, long before anyone with their surname had come to Raleigh County. She said the fire ring was old, older than anyone she knew, and she said that on certain nights, when the conditions were right, the fires there would light themselves. She said it was a sign that a gathering was happening, whether anyone living could see it or not. Ray paused and looked at us with an expression that fell somewhere between apology and warning. He said his grandmother never told him who gathered there. He said she'd been asked once, and she'd shaken her head and said it wasn't for her to say. He said she'd camped on every other part of the property but never within sight of that clearing, and she never explained why. She just said, "You don't go to someone else's meeting place uninvited. And if you find yourself there when the fire lights, you sit still, and you wait, and you leave in the morning, and you don't take the stones. Whatever you do," she said, "you don't touch the stones." Ray asked us if we'd touched them. Kevin and I looked at each other. We hadn't. We'd counted them and looked at them and left them exactly where they were. Ray nodded. "Good," he said, and then he changed the subject and never brought it up again. I need to tell you something about how sound works in the mountains before I tell you what I heard. It's important because the first thing anyone says when I describe this experience is that sound carries strangely in hilly terrain, and I need you to know that I understand acoustic phenomena as well as any layperson and better than most. I studied environmental science at WVU. I've spent hundreds of nights in the backcountry across West Virginia, Virginia, and the Carolinas. I know about temperature inversions that create sound channels in valleys. I know about the way rain can amplify and redirect sound over distances that seem impossible. I know that white noise, the sustained hiss of rain on a forest canopy, can create auditory pareidolia, the brain constructing patterns from random noise the way it constructs faces from clouds. I know all of this, and none of it explains what I heard near Seneca Rocks in November of 2022. The trip was a solo overnighter into a section of the Monongahela National Forest that I'd been wanting to explore for about a year. It was east of Seneca Rocks, in the drainage between North Fork Mountain and a series of unnamed ridges that form the eastern boundary of the forest. The terrain is steep and densely wooded, mostly hardwood at lower elevations, transitioning to red spruce and hemlock on the upper slopes, with the kind of thick rhododendron understory that makes off-trail travel a negotiation between ambition and reality. I'd picked a campsite from the topo map, a flat bench on the side of a ridge about 2 miles from the nearest maintained trail, in a stand of red spruce that the satellite imagery showed as a dark, dense patch of canopy at around 3,800 feet. The weather had been gray and wet for 3 days before I went in. A November pattern, a low-pressure system parked over the central Appalachians, producing the kind of endless, gray drizzle that doesn't have the energy to be a real rainstorm, but doesn't have the decency to stop either. The mountains disappeared into the clouds, the hollows filled with fog. Everything was wet, the trails, the trees, the air itself saturated with moisture that hung in the atmosphere like suspended water. Not quite rain, not quite fog, just a permanent dampness that soaked through everything regardless of waterproofing. I hiked in on a Friday afternoon, leaving the trail after about a mile and bushwhacking uphill through the hardwood and into the spruce. The transition between the two forest types was abrupt, as it often is at elevation, and within 100 yards of entering the spruce stand, the world changed. The light dropped, the wind died. The canopy closed overhead like a lid, and the rain, which had been falling on me directly, was now filtered through layers of needles and branches until it arrived at ground level as a fine, constant mist. The sound change, D2. In the hardwood forest, the rain had been a patter, individual drops hitting individual leaves, a stochastic percussion that varied with the wind. In the spruce, it became a hiss. A constant, undifferentiated hiss filled the stand from every direction simultaneously, as if the forest were exhaling. It was the loudest quiet sound I'd ever heard, a wall of white noise that erased everything else and created a sonic environment in which the only sounds that could penetrate were the loudest or the closest. I found my campsite around 3. The bench was everything the map had promised. A flat section of ground, maybe 20 feet across, carpeted with spruce needles, sheltered on three sides by the dense spruce canopy, and open on the fourth to a slope that dropped away toward the hollow below. I pitched my tent, strung my tarp, cooked dinner on my camp stove, and settled in for an evening of reading and early sleep. The spruce stand was dim even before the sun went down, the canopy blocking what little light the overcast sky provided, and by 5 o'clock I was in my tent with my headlamp and a book, listening to the rain hiss through the needles and feeling the particular, encompassing loneliness of being the only person for miles in every direction. I fell asleep around 9. The hiss of the rain was a constant companion, filling the tent with a sound that was both soothing and slightly oppressive, the way very loud silence can be oppressive when you're aware that it's masking everything else. I slept lightly, the way I always do on the first night in a new place, surfacing periodically into a half-awareness where the rain registered and the tent registered and my position in the world registered, and then sleep pulled me back under. Around 11, and I surfaced again and didn't go back under. Something was different. I lay in my sleeping bag. G and 2 listened, and I tried to identify what had changed. The rain was the same. The wind was the same. The hiss of the spruce was the same. But underneath it, woven into the white noise like a thread in fabric, there was something else. Something that my sleeping brain had detected and my waking brain was now trying to isolate and identify. Voices, 2 of them, men, speaking in low conversational tones that rose and fell with the natural cadence of speech, the back and forth rhythm of 2 people having a relaxed conversation. They were faint, just barely above the threshold of the rain noise, coming from somewhere uphill from my campsite, in the direction of the ridge above the spruce stand. I couldn't make out words. The rain was too loud and the distance too great for individual syllables to survive the journey from source to ear. But the pattern was unmistakable. One voice would speak for several seconds, a rising and falling sequence of tones, and then the other would respond, and the first would pick up again, and the exchange continued with the easy, overlapping rhythm of people who were comfortable with each other and in no hurry to finish what they were saying. My first thought was hikers. Someone else had camped on the ridge above me and was up late, talking in their tent, their voices carrying through the spruce and the rain to my position below. It was the most rational explanation, and I held on to it for about 2 minutes before the problems with it became apparent. Nobody hikes into roadless terrain in a November rainstorm for an overnight camping trip. The nearest trail was 2 miles away. The terrain between the trail and this ridge was steep, densely vegetated, and nearly impassable in the dark. And the voices weren't muffled the way voices in a tent are muffled. They were open-air voices, clear and present, the sound of 2 people standing in the rain and talking to each other without shelter or barrier. I called out, "Hey, hello up there." My voice sounded flat and small, absorbed by the spruce and the rain before it traveled more than a few yards. The voices stopped, immediately. The same instant response you'd expect from people who heard an unexpected sound and paused to listen. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. The rain hissed. The spruce dripped. And then the voices started again. Closer. Not dramatically closer, not as if they'd taken 10 steps in my direction, but perceptibly closer, maybe 50 feet nearer than they'd been before. Still conversational, still calm, still exchanging words in that easy, measured rhythm. I turned on my headlamp and pointed the beam uphill. The light cut through the mist and illuminated spruce trunks and branches, and the rain falling in silver lines through the beam, and nothing else. No people, no movement, no shapes between the trees. The beam reached maybe 100 feet before the moisture in the air diffused it into a white glow that showed nothing. The voices continued throughout, unaffected by the light, unchanged in volume or tone, as if the beam was irrelevant to whatever was producing the sound. I called out again, louder. The voices paused, started again, closer still. Maybe 30 feet now, close enough that I should have been able to see whoever was speaking, close enough that my headlamp should have caught a jacket or a face, or the reflection of eyes in the beam. But there was nothing. Just spruce and rain and mist and the voices, calm and steady, talking to each other as if I didn't exist. For the next 3 hours, they circled my campsite. That's the only way to describe the movement. The voices traveled around the perimeter of my camp, sometimes uphill, sometimes downhill, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, maintaining a distance of roughly 30 to 50 feet and never approaching closer. The conversation never stopped. It flowed continuously, one voice handing off to the other with the seamless timing of people who have been talking for so long that the exchange has become automatic. Sometimes the voices were close enough that I could almost distinguish individual words, almost recognizable sounds, syllables that my brain nearly resolved into language before they slipped back into unintelligibility. And sometimes they faded to the edge of hearing, blending with the rain until I couldn't be sure they were still there, and then resurging, clear and present, from a new direction. I tried everything. I called out 6 more times. The voices would pause each time and then resume from a slightly different position. I swept my headlamp in every direction, nothing visible. I banged my cook pot with a spoon, making as much noise as I could. The voices didn't react. They just continued, calm and persistent, and completely indifferent to my attempts to interact with them. At some point in the second hour, I stopped trying to make them stop and started trying to understand them. I lay in my tent with the headlamp on. And I listened with the focused attention I'd been trained to apply to environmental data, trying to isolate variables, trying to extract information from the sound itself. The voices were male, both of them, with a similar register but distinguishable by cadence, one slightly faster and higher pitched than the other. The conversation had a structure, long passages from one voice followed by shorter responses from the other, then a reversal, the second voice speaking at length while the first offered brief interjections. It sounded like storytelling, one person narrating and the other listening and occasionally commenting. The rhythm was ancient and familiar, the oldest form of human communication. 2 people sitting together in the dark, one of them talking, the other bearing witness. But the language was wrong. That's the part that makes the hair on my arms stand up even now, sitting in my apartment in Morgantown, writing this down in daylight. The voices were speaking a language I didn't recognize. Not a foreign language that I could identify by its sound profile. I've heard Spanish and French and German and Mandarin and Arabic, and I can distinguish between them, even when I can't understand the words. This was none of those. It wasn't any language I'd ever encountered in any context. The phonemes were unfamiliar, combinations of sounds that didn't match any linguistic pattern I knew. Some consonants sounded like they were produced deeper in the throat than any modern language requires. Some vowels held for longer than felt natural, sustained tones that stretched the syllables into something almost musical. And the rhythm of the speech was different from anything I'd heard, a cadence that felt older than the languages I knew, as if the grammar and syntax were structured around rules that predated the ones I was familiar with. At dawn, the voices faded, not abruptly. Gradually, the way a radio signal weakens as you drive out of range. The conversation grew quieter, more distant. The words blending back into the rain hiss until I couldn't distinguish between the two and then couldn't hear the voices at all. The rain continued. The spruce dripped. The morning came gray and cold and empty of everything except the weather and the forest and the silence where the voices had been. I packed up and hiked out. I didn't see anyone on the trail. I didn't see footprints or camping evidence on the ridge above my site. The only marks in the mud of the spruce stand were my own, a single set of boot prints leading from the trail to my campsite and back. Whatever had been speaking in the rain that night hadn't left tracks, hadn't disturbed the ground, hadn't left any physical evidence that it had been there. I've talked to people about this. A linguistics professor at WVU who specializes in Appalachian dialect and indigenous languages, a folklorist who collects oral histories from the Potomac Highlands, an old ranger at the Seneca Rocks Visitor Center who has been working these mountains for 40 years. The linguist said it could have been auditory pareidolia, my brain constructing speech patterns from random rain noise. The folklorist said there are stories in the region about voices in the mountains that go back to before European settlement, voices that the Shawnee and the Delaware associated with the oldest parts of the forest, the places where the spruce grows thickly, and the elevation is highest, and the land has never been cleared. The ranger just looked at me for a long time, and then said, "There are things in these mountains that talk to each other." He said it the way you say the sky is blue. Not as an opinion, as a fact. I go back to the Monongahela regularly. I camp alone. I sleep in the spruce. But I don't camp on that ridge anymore. And on rainy nights in November, I lie in my tent and I listen to the hiss of the rain on the needle, and I parse the white noise for patterns, for the rise and fall of voices that might be hiding in the frequency of the water hitting the canopy. I haven't heard them again, but I listen, because whatever was speaking in the spruce that night was not speaking to me. It wasn't aware of me, or if it was, I was irrelevant. It was two voices engaged in a conversation that had been going on long before I arrived and continued long after I left. Two presences moving through the oldest part of the forest in the rain and the dark, speaking a language that nobody alive understands, telling stories to each other in the patient, unhurried rhythm of beings that have all the time in the world. And I wonder what they were saying, and I wonder who they were saying it to. And I wonder, on the nights when the rain sounds almost like words, and the wind sounds almost like a voice, whether the language they were speaking is one that used to be known. One that used to be spoken by people who lived in these mountains before the names we know were given to the rivers and the ridges. One that was lost, the way languages are lost, not destroyed but abandoned, left behind in the high places and the deep hollows and the spruce stands where no one goes, still spoken by whatever remains of the speakers, still carrying stories that no one alive can hear. Except in the rain, except at night, except when you're alone, and the white noise drops just low enough for the words to come through, faint and clear, from somewhere just beyond the edge of what you're supposed to hear. I've told this story to exactly 4 people. My brother, who thinks I sleepwalked. My doctor ordered a sleep study that came back normal. A therapist I saw for 3 sessions before deciding that talking about it was making it worse, not better. And a woman I was dating who listened to the whole thing without interrupting and then asked me, very gently, if I'd been drinking that night. I hadn't. I don't drink when I'm in the backcountry. I don't take medication. I don't use recreational substances of any kind when I'm alone in the woods, because impairment in the wilderness is a recipe for the kind of accident that nobody finds until the smell leads them to you. I was sober and clear-headed and in good physical and mental health when I went to sleep in my tent near Otter Creek Wilderness on October 14th, 2023. And I was sober and clear-headed and in good physical and mental health when I woke up at 4 in the morning, lying in the mud 30 feet from that tent with no memory of how I got there. The trip was supposed to be 3 nights. I'd taken a Thursday and Friday off from my job at a surveying firm in Elkins and driven south to the Otter Creek trailhead, planning to hike about 4 miles into the wilderness and camp near one of the creek's feeder streams where the fishing was good and the solitude was reliable. Otter Creek is one of the more popular wilderness areas in the Monongahela, but popularity is relative when you're talking about backcountry in West Virginia, and in mid-October, after the leaf peeping season has peaked, and before hunting season begins in earnest, the trails are mostly empty. The rain started while I was driving to the trailhead. By the time I parked and shouldered my pack, it was coming down steadily, the kind of persistent mountain rain that settles in with the resolve of a permanent resident. The trail followed the creek through a narrow valley, hemlock and birch and rhododendron pressing in from both sides, the path muddy and slick with leaves. I hiked for about 3 miles before the rain intensified enough to make me reconsider my timeline. The creek was rising. The trail crossings that were normally shin-deep were approaching knee-deep, and the current was strong enough to make me brace against my trekking poles at each ford. I decided to cut the trip short, find a campsite for the night, and hike out in the morning. The spot I found was about 50 yards off the main trail, up a slight rise and into a dense thicket of rhododendron that formed a natural shelter. The rhododendron in Otter Creek grows in impenetrable tangles, the branches arching over and interlocking to create tunnel-like passages through the understory that are dark and sheltered even in daylight. I found a small opening in the thicket where the ground was relatively flat, and the canopy overhead was dense enough to block most of the rain. It wasn't ideal. The ground was soft, tea in the space was tight, but it was the best I was going to find without hiking another mile in deteriorating conditions. I pitched my tent in the opening, a 1-person ultralight just big enough for me and my sleeping bag with a small vestibule for my boots and pack. I staked it down, tightened the rain fly, and crawled inside. The tent was dry, and the sleeping bag was dry, and the rain on the fly was a familiar, comforting percussion that told my brain it was time to stop being alert and start being asleep. I took off my boots and placed them in the vestibule, laces loose. I zipped the tent door from the inside, pulling the slider from the bottom to the top and securing it at the apex. I got into my sleeping bag, zipped it to my chin, and closed my eyes. I fell asleep within minutes. The exhaustion of the hike in the rain and the early start combined to pull me under quickly, the way water pulls a stone, a straight drop into unconsciousness without the gradual descent of a normal night's sleep. I don't remember dreaming. I don't remember waking or shifting, or any of the micro-arousals that sleep studies tell us happen dozens of times a night. I remember closing my eyes in my tent at approximately 9 in the evening, and I remember opening them at approximately 4 in the morning. I was not in my tent. I was lying on my back. The rain was falling directly onto my face. The sky above me was dark, the heavy, lightless dark of a clouded mountain night with no moon and no stars. I was wet, soaked through, my hair plastered to my skull, and rain running in rivulets across my closed eyelids and into my ears. I blinked the water away and tried to orient myself and felt the ground beneath me, not the smooth nylon floor of my tent, but the soft, cold, yielding surface of mud beneath my back, mud beneath my legs. The smell of it, rich and organic, fills my nostrils with every breath. I was still in my sleeping bag, zipped closed, the zipper pull tucked under my chin exactly where I'd left it when I went to sleep. The bag was waterlogged, heavy with rain, pressed against my body by the weight of the water it had absorbed. And my boots were on my feet, laced, tied. The same boots I had placed in the vestibule of my tent with the laces loose, positioned side by side on the ground cloth, tucked under the rainfly flap. They were on my feet inside my sleeping bag, which should have been physically impossible since the sleeping bag zipped from the bottom and the opening was at my chest, not at my feet, and putting boots on while inside a zipped sleeping bag would require either unzipping the bag completely or performing a contortion that I am not flexible enough to achieve. I sat up. The world was dark and wet, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I fumbled for my headlamp, which I normally kept in a pocket inside the tent, and found it clipped to the chest strap of the sleeping bag, which was not where I had left it. I turned it on. The beam showed me a rhododendron, a wall of it, dense and dark and dripping, forming a circle around a small clearing of bare ground, maybe 10 feet in diameter. I was in the center of the clearing. The mud beneath me held the impression of my body, a shallow, person-shaped depression in the soft earth that was already filling with rain. Beyond the body print, the mud was smooth, undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no indication that anything had crossed the clearing to deliver me to its center. The mud was a blank page with a single word written on it: me. I stood up, still in the sleeping bag, and struggled out of it. The wet nylon clung to my legs, and I had to peel it away like a second skin. My clothes beneath were soaked. The boots on my feet were tight, laced with the double knot I always use, as if I'd tied them myself with the same care I always applied. I looked around the clearing. The rhododendron formed a nearly perfect circle, the branches interlocking overhead to create a dome that was open at the center, admitting the rain in a column of water that fell directly onto the spot where I'd been lying. The clearing felt intentional, not natural, not the random gap that occurs when a tree falls and the canopy opens. This was geometric, deliberate. A room in the forest with walls of rhododendron and a ceiling of rain. My tent was visible through a gap in the rhododendron, maybe 30 feet away. The orange rainfly, a faint glow in the headlamp beam. I pushed through the branches and walked to it. The tent was intact, staked down, rainfly taut, and the door was zipped shut. From the outside, the slider was at the top of the track, in the closed position, the way it would be if someone had stood outside the tent and pulled the zipper from the bottom to the top after the occupant was no longer inside. You cannot zip a tent door from the outside if you are inside. The geometry doesn't work. Someone or something had removed me from the tent and zipped the door closed behind me. I opened the tent and looked inside. My sleeping pad was there, inflated, positioned exactly where I'd laid it out. The stuff sack for my sleeping bag was in the corner. My pack was in the vestibule. Everything was in its place. The only things missing were me, my sleeping bag, and my boots, the three items that had been transported 30 feet through the rain and deposited in a circular clearing in the rhododendron without leaving a single mark on the ground between point A and point B. I packed my camp. I did it in the dark, in the rain, with hands that were shaking from cold and something else that I won't call fear, because fear implies understanding, and I had none. I stuffed the wet sleeping bag into my pack. I broke down the tent. I loaded everything, and I put on my headlamp, and I hiked out. 4 in the morning, 3 miles of trail in the dark and the rain, mud and creek crossings, and the constant sound of water moving through a landscape that felt different now, charged with a presence I couldn't identify, but could feel pressing against me from every direction. The feeling started as soon as I left the campsite. Not the feeling of being followed, the feeling of being watched from above. I know the difference because I've experienced both. Being followed is a sensation that comes from behind you, a pressure on the back of your neck, a heightened awareness of the space between your shoulder blades. Being watched from above is different. It's a weight on the top of your head, a consciousness of the canopy as something other than vegetation, a sense that the trees are not just growing over the trail but observing it, and that something in the branches, or above the branches, or moving between the branches without touching them, is tracking your movement with an attention that is patient and sustained and entirely focused on you. I felt it for the entire 3-mile hike, every step, every creek crossing, every section of trail where the rhododendron closed over my head and the headlamp beam bounced off wet leaves and the rain fell through gaps in the canopy in concentrated streams that felt like they were aimed. I walked with my head down and my pace fast, and I didn't look up. I don't know why I didn't look up. Some instinct, some deep, nonverbal understanding that looking up would mean seeing something, and seeing it would mean knowing something, and knowing it would mean living with that knowledge for the rest of my life. I reached the trailhead at 5:30. My truck was where I'd left it. The parking lot was empty. I threw my pack in the back. Dee got behind the wheel, started the engine, and sat there with the heater on and the headlights cutting through the rain, and the windshield wipers sweeping the water away in rhythmic arcs. The forest stood at the edge of the lot, dark and dripping and silent. The canopy above the trees was invisible in the dark, a black void that could have contained anything or nothing. I drove home to Elkins. I took a shower that lasted 45 minutes. I sat on the edge of my bed in a towel, and I looked at my boots, which were sitting on the bathroom floor where I'd taken them off. They were caked with mud from the hike out. But beneath the fresh mud, on the leather of the upper portions that would have been inside my sleeping bag, there was no mud. They were clean. Whoever had put them on my feet had done so before placing me in the mud, not after. The boots had been laced and tied on my feet while I was still dry, still inside the tent, still in my sleeping bag. And then I'd been moved, sleeping bag and all, placed in the clearing, left in the rain, and the tent had been zipped shut behind me, the door sealed, the camp left intact, as if I were being returned from somewhere and the tent was being closed because I wouldn't be needing it anymore. I did the sleep study. Normal. No parasomnias. No sleepwalking. No REM behavior disorder. The neurologist said my brain showed no signs of the electrical patterns associated with unconscious locomotion. "You didn't walk there in your sleep," he said. And I said, "I know." And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that if I didn't walk there, something carried me. I still camp. I still go into the backcountry alone, but I don't camp in the rhododendron anymore, and I don't camp near Otter Creek. And on the nights when I'm in my tent and the rain is falling and the forest is dark and the canopy is pressing down on the world like a hand pressing down on a blanket, I zip my tent from the inside, and I check the zipper twice, and I put my boots outside the vestibule, not inside, because I don't want to wake up with them on. I don't want to open my eyes and find that something has dressed me for a trip I didn't agree to take. I don't want to be placed somewhere, arranged somewhere, left in the mud in a perfect circle of rhododendron, like an offering or a specimen, or a message that I'm not equipped to read. I sleep with the zipper checked, and the boots outside, and the headlamp in my hand instead of clipped to my bag. And in the moments before sleep takes me, when the rain is loud, and the tent is small, and the forest is close, I listen. Not for sounds outside the tent, for movement inside, for the feeling of being lifted, for the transition from here to there that happened without my knowledge or consent on a night in October when the rain was falling, and the canopy was watching. NG and something moved me 30 feet through the air without leaving a mark on the ground, and set me down gently, and zipped the door, and went back up into whatever space it occupies above the trees, patient and silent, waiting for the next time someone sleeps alone in the rhododendron and gives it a reason to come down.